The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 851. Wait. If we follow the scripts of other countries, this situation should have broken out in a bloody conflict like France. However, the reality is that there are also many people in the army who are dissatisfied with Metternich. Coupled with the blessing of nationalism, the Austrian army, following the Bavarian Guards, also joined the rebellion. The army set up cannons directly outside the Prime Minister's office. Seeing that nothing could be done, France's insiders, who had been deployed in advance, could only propose burning Metternich, so as to have the proper punishment effect. And we cannot kill innocent people indiscriminately, so people other than Metternich should be allowed to leave the Prime Minister's office before taking action. The people were still very reasonable, so they made way for innocent people to pass. After the innocents left, torches were thrown into the Prime Minister's office from all directions. The fire burned for a full day and night, and it is said that even Metternich's ashes were burned. On the pier in Vienna, an old lady wearing a white wig kept looking back, and the old servant on the side pulled her into the cabin. "Come on, sir. Archduke Franz says California needs you." After Metternich stepped down, Count Karloff thought he had finally defeated his old rival and could implement his own reforms. However, Francis II had already left a legacy. If Metternich is unable to perform the duties of regent for special reasons, Pillersdorfer will take over as regent. Pillersdorf also had disagreements with Count Karloff, and the mess Metternich had left was too much for them to deal with. Declare war on the Papal States? Don't be kidding. With the current situation in Europe, everyone is looking for a scapegoat. Whoever takes action first will die. Except the Papal States offer. The ruins of the Prime Minister's office are still hot. Moreover, the two royal princes have made no move, and it seems that the royal family is not prepared to pursue this matter at this time. They remembered Archduke Franz, who had gone to Tyrol to take office. After all, the latter had a distinguished reputation, was a member of the royal family, and was the future emperor. Maybe some people would like this feeling of being needed, but Franz only felt that they wanted to use him as a shield. He didn't like this feeling very much, but the intensity of nationalism at this time did exceed his imagination. It has obviously been suppressed for so many years. From the earliest Helkini Baron and Ludwig von Lenz to the latest Andres Pretorius, Franz has never stopped suppressing extremes. Nationalist repression. The methods employed include, but are not limited to, fines, imprisonment, exile, and even assassination. But the results were not ideal, and its scale and influence still far exceeded those of the German nationalists in history. But at this time, we really couldn't let those idiots in the Imperial government continue to mess around. Franz's reply was wait. Yes, the competition at this time is patience. The political situation in France, Britain, Spain, and Prussia is also in chaos. Whoever loses his composure first will lose. France is the key to this. As long as this most critical link collapses, the invisible network against Austria will no longer exist. And France will definitely collapse. The reason Franz is so sure of this is because if it doesn't collapse, someone will help it collapse. For example, a gunshot, a leader, or a La Marseillaise. But in the final analysis, Louis Philippe's rule was too weak. Otherwise it would not be so easy for others to take advantage of the loopholes. But no matter what, Franz would not let France, a close neighbor, breathe another breath, and he would never let it transfer the conflict to Austria. As for the British threat, most of it will remain verbal. After all, Austria's geographical location is not suitable for being invaded by sea, and the latter is not the main threat to the former. Doing so is completely outweighing the gains and losses. It should be impossible for smart British people to make this mistake. This kind of mistake. During the waiting period, Franz did not want to care about the pressure faced by the Austrian imperial government, and had no need to care about it. In fact, he would like to change the government a few more times, just in time to clean up those loyal corrupt criminals. Many times it was difficult for Franz to take matters into his own hands. Due to the fatal flaw in the conferral system, the Austrian Imperial government had a large number of loyal ministers with stable food fields. They didn't do anything bad, but they didn't do anything useful either. However, these people have occupied a large number of positions in government departments for generations. Their work efficiency is approximately zero, and they are not as useful as outsourced affairs officers at the bottom. It only affects work efficiency and takes up national resources, but at the top, the impact is extremely bad. Point. Whether they are willing or not, they will actively or passively become the backbone or even the leader of some factions. Then inbreeding began, and even top geniuses in certain disciplines like Darwin, Bach, and Einstein could only produce a bunch of mediocre fools, not to mention this group of useless waste. For example, Count Pilersdorf, who was taking over the throne at this time, and entered the Regent Council, was far less capable than Prince Metternich, but he was destined to be where he is today from more than 10 years ago, even as soon as he was born. Franz II was not a genius like Kang Ming and Zhang Liang. He was just a mediocre old man. But he could still count to this day more than 10 years later, for no other reason than his familiarity. However, Franz was unable to deal with such a group of guys who were in a dead position, but he couldn't deal with them in an overly aggressive way. It's funny to say that they are the cornerstone of the empire. Franz must get the support of these people if he wants his reform to be successful, but who would want to revolutionize his own life? This is not a problem that can be solved by Franz ascending the throne, because even if Franz becomes the emperor, he still cannot betray his own class. So Franz needs a big chaos in the world, but before that he must make all preparations. Only a strong body could survive this strong dose. And after that the Austrian Empire would be reborn. In fact, Franz initially wanted to use conservative reform methods to subtly carry out limited reforms. However, some small repairs could only save a temporary period, but not the whole life. As for the new Regency Council wanting to break away from Franz's control and act on its own, this is actually unlikely, because Franz has already made it clear to the two elders of the family. As long as the two royal princes disagree, the Regency Council is just a decoration. As for Count Latter, Franz did not intend to let him stay in Vienna anymore. After all, this man was very impulsive and easy to get angry, but he still had loyalty and ability. So Franz felt that Belgrade was a good place. First of all, Belgrade was well armed and well prepared. Secondly, it was actually surrounded by Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. There must be someone who dared to fight to defend it here. Historically, Count Latter died tragically. He took a series of drastic measures, but still could not stabilize the situation in Vienna. When the second wave of panic arrived, Count Latter stayed alone in the hall of the Ministry of War in order not to harm others. However, no one appreciated his courage. In the end, the brave earl was stabbed into a sieve and hung in front of the War Department. Chapter 852 Staff Headquarters. In fact, there was another reason for transferring Count Latter away from Vienna. In order to cope with the upcoming war, Franz prepared to take the opportunity to establish a general staff. At this time, the Austrian Empire was still in an era where the emperor and the minister of war thought about how to command and command. The generals on the front line were responsible for military, logistics, and finance. While marching and fighting, they had to spend a lot of energy paying attention to trivial matters. The military qualities of the emperor, war ministers, and generals were uneven. Because of this, enemy countries could often create miracles when fighting Austria. Even if a few generals achieve victory in some areas, they are rarely able to turn this advantage into victory. There were actually other reasons for establishing the general staff, but they were not immediately apparent. For example, the conscription system and the selection of generals will soon fall behind the times, and the scale of future wars will become larger and larger. The military recruitment system will place a heavy economic burden on the country. Relatively speaking, conscripts influenced by nationalism and nationalism are cheaper and have higher enthusiasm, which is the so-called subjective initiative. At the same time, it can also solve the problem of loyalty that has troubled rulers for thousands of years. The rebellion of these mercenaries who are paid to do things is not new. And due to the advancement of weapons, the gap between so-called professional soldiers and conscripts on the frontal battlefield is narrowing. Especially at this time, line pushing tactics are popular. Except for the rare strong army, generally speaking, Whoever has more people wins, and whoever is bolder wins. As for the selection of generals, Austrian officers at this time were usually hereditary. That's right. Austria does have military schools, but most of the students are nobles. It was as difficult for civilians to enter military academies as to be admitted to the University of Vienna, the highest institution of learning in the Austrian Empire at that time. However, behind this single plank bridge is a narrower plank bridge. Most of the teachers in the military academy are also nobles. They are not necessarily biased, but the families of nobles, especially military nobles, are often related to each other, so the children of those nobles are more likely to be taken care of. Even if you cross this gap, there is still a chain bridge after the wooden plank bridge. According to the Austrian Empire's officer promotion rules, officers with the rank of second lieutenant or below who want to be promoted must go to the battlefield and participate in 3 battles with the first platoon of soldiers. Even if the children of many civilians graduate from military academies, they are usually only non-commissioned officers. If they start from the lowest level of corporal, then from corporal to second lieutenant, he will face the test of life and death 9 times. It can be said to be a narrow escape. Children of nobles are usually already second lieutenants after graduating from military schools, and they can skip these tests completely. This is just a microcosm of the shortcomings in the selection of generals in the Austrian Empire. There are even more terrifying ones, directly taking money to get the position. For example, the famous General Fernand Lizzi, who joined the army as a general, fought countless defeats in his life, but could still hold the position of commander-in-chief of the Venetian local defense force on an equal footing with Marshal Radetzky. Although Franz has never been a soldier for a day, he still has the rank of colonel. This is a rank that many people cannot achieve, even if they work hard throughout their lives. In fact, if Franz really wanted to be a soldier, his military rank would depend entirely on his own imagination. But this is also a big cake, because the relevant chain of interests can even extend to everyone in the entire country. In addition to a separate general staff, Franz is also preparing to establish a dedicated logistics department, intelligence department, equipment department, and weapons development department. In the past, these were all under the unified control of the war department. The top management usually had one person holding multiple positions, while the bottom level was too bloated. The result was management chaos. If there was a problem, it would not even be possible to find where the problem was in the past, except for military personnel who were good at command. Other talents in the Ministry of War were often not valued, and logistics and weapons were outsourced to businessmen for a long time. As you can imagine, the outsourcing businessmen only considered profits, so the Austrian army often ran out of food, medicine, and weapons and equipment in the past. During the era of Queen Nissa, the Austrian army often had problems with supplies. The war lasted from summer to winter, but the boots missing from the military uniforms were never shipped. The soldiers could only wrap their feet with rags and continue to fight in the ice and snow. The reason turned out to be that due to the rise in war prices, outsourcing merchants were unwilling to bear losses and wanted to wait until prices fell to replenish their boots. This businessman was also very knowledgeable, and even Prime Minister Kaunitz helped conceal it. In the end, the Queen only found out about it because she accidentally came into contact with a wounded soldier who had retreated from the front line. The angry Queen wanted to execute the bold businessman, but was blocked by almost the entire palace. In the end, she just asked him to make up the difference, and then replaced him with a more loyal and reliable outsourcing businessman. Franz didn't want to make the same mistakes again, let alone be led by others. He needed a more reasonable logistics department. In addition, the status of weapons developers in the Austrian Empire was very low. Vincent Augustine, the chief weapons designer mentioned many times in the previous article, did not reach the rank of general until his death. Not only do weapons developers have a low status, their incomes are also low. For fear of weapons designers using their expertise to arbitrage from the state. Therefore, the Austrian Empire prohibits weapon developers from participating in the manufacture of weapons, and the Austrian Empire will provide weapon design drawings to manufacturers. As a result, the confidentiality of the Austrian Empire's military industry is almost zero, because enemy countries can easily buy the design drawings of Austrian weapons from middlemen. at very low prices, and even those weapons designers are selling them themselves to make a living. Because of this, the Austrian Empire has never been able to retain military, scientific and technological talents. With low status, low income, and their own inventions not being valued, it is strange that some people can still enjoy it. Franz felt that he must give him enough attention, and his status or income should at least satisfy his vanity in one aspect, so as to give people enough motivation, and not exhaust the power of innovation. Although Franz has the development trend of weapons in the next 100 years, they are the ones who actually create these weapons, so Franz built his own arsenal, and those weapons designers could get a share of the weapons sold. In addition, in order to encourage designers to develop new weapons, Franz also created many awards and support funds. As the first chief of general staff, Franz felt that Archduke Karol should be appointed, because the latter is a rare theorist and practitioner in Austria and even in the entire era. What's even more commendable is that Archduke Karol is a member of the royal family, and because of his lofty status in the military, he can minimize the resistance to reform. At this time, the general staff will be superior to the Ministry of War. This is also the need of the war. After all, except for Archduke Albrecht, Marshal Radetzky and Hainaut, Franz is not sure that anyone else has the qualifications to be a famous general. Chapter 853, Declaration of War. Although later generations often refer to Josip Jele, Prince Windisch-Gratz and Marshal Radetzky as the triumvirate who saved the Austrian Empire. But in fact, the command level of Prince Windisch-Gratz and Jelassic is really limited. It doesn't take any experts to deal with them. Even Franz doesn't take them seriously. Albrecht privately, he reduced them to nothing. Count Stadion was a versatile man in both civil and military affairs, but he was so stubborn that he contracted the plague at this critical moment. In fact, it was said to be a plague, but it was actually some kind of strange disease that had not been discovered by medicine at that time. At this time, the doctors were helpless. In order to appear that they were not so incompetent, they blamed the refugees and the plague. Gab Lenz was a famous general in later generations, but at this time, neither ability nor qualifications were enough to hold such a high position. Hainaut is capable, but he is too reckless. The remaining veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, such as Marshal Leinton von Pinkly and Tim Schindler, have no problem with their loyalty, but their thinking is still stuck in the last century. As for unruly and young officers like Amidst and Heinrich Behm, there was even less hope. At this time, Benedek was just a minor major, of course. Allowing the general staff to override the Ministry of War is only temporary, and is just to facilitate unified dispatch and command during the war. Franz would not let a group of staff lead him by the nose. Vienna, Hofburg Palace. Metternich's exit did not bring about the peace he imagined. The domestic situation became increasingly chaotic, and Count Korolev's corruption and bribery were also exposed. The huge amount made people angry. Count Korolev knew that no one could protect himself at this time, so he directly submitted his resignation and fled Vienna. Prince Metternich and Count Korolev, two factions fell. However, there is still no shortage of replacements in the Regency Council, and Count Fickelmont quickly entered the palace to fill Count Korolev's vacancy. However, before the Count could stay in office until the second day, word of his glorious deeds of bullying men and women in his hometown reached Vienna. Pillersdorf did not stay in the Regency Council for more than a few days before he resigned because of his anti-German nationalist remarks in the German Confederation. Chaos continues, with many officials resigning and many others joining. The former are naturally those guys who are waiting to die because they see that the situation is not good and the wind is blowing. The people who join later are much more complicated. There are nobles who are loyal to this country, there are shareholders of the Royal Overseas Development Company, and some are just waiting. It took decades to finally fill the gap, but of course there were also a lot of speculators and saboteurs. However, no matter how many people resign, the institutions of the Austrian Empire can still operate normally, and the army of hundreds of thousands to fill the vacancies cannot be covered. At this time, divisions also arose within the people. The continued unrest led to the destruction of the original order, and a large number of supervisory agencies went offline collectively. While this freedom is great for some people, most people suffer from it. First of all, with skyrocketing prices, without government restrictions, businesses have regained control over pricing freedom. All kinds of daily necessities are priced almost every hour. Even coffin shops are following the trend, and the prices have doubled several times. You can understand the reason. After all, the French Revolution has not been around for many years. Secondly, there are ubiquitous crimes, ranging from theft and robbery to murder and arson. Gangs have begun to brazenly fight, grab territory, and collect protection fees. In order to reflect their fearful nature, gangs began to change their names to be more down to earth. Names such as Justice League, Avengers, Heaven and Earth Club appeared one after another on the streets. The factory owners and bankers who had been severely beaten by Franz in the past also survived. Workers' wages were directly cut in half, and working hours were restored to the 18-hour work system. All kinds of small loans, loan sharks, and ancestral loans are all resurrected, and the two parties are joining forces to reconstruct the world. But the freedom is only temporary. After all, the royal family will not allow them to do this. The days when they were suppressed by Franz to the point where they were almost unprofitable are still vivid in their minds. So these people found Solomon Rothschild, but the former underground king of Vienna did not want to get involved in this matter. He knew very well that Archduke Franz was not that easy to deal with. How could he give up so easily when he was leading an opponent that even half of Europe's financiers could not defeat? Moreover, Franz's Lackazatius Bank and Sinner Bank did not mess around, so Solomon's own bank could not mess around either. As for reminding my colleagues, do not make jokes. Colleagues are enemies, and Solomon hopes that these people will have a bloody encounter so that he can make a lot of money, even if he does not violate the rules of the game. So why should he bother? Solomon Rothschild was considered the most influential business tycoon in Vienna at this time. He refused to come forward, so the Austrian bourgeoisie had to find other agents. Then Guschen Cass and Alexander Bach came into their sight. These two people were representatives of the Viennese liberals at this time. They naturally understand what those businessmen and bankers want, that is to fix their power in the form of law. That's right. They needed a constitution to limit imperial power while protecting their own rights. This coincided with the views of the liberals. The two sides hit it off and immediately began to prepare for a larger march or even an attack to force the royal family and the government to compromise. However, for the sake of safety, they still united northern Italy, Bohemia, and Hungary to put pressure on the Austrian imperial government and the royal family. Northern Italy was heavily suppressed, and the uprising was not smooth. The Czech nationalists in Bohemia did not encounter official attacks, but the cross-border German nationalists were already too much for them. Hungary was the only one who was at ease at this time. Before the Viennese contacted them, these descendants of the Huns even seemed a little low-key. However, how could they be willing to take second place when it came to adding insult to injury to the Austrian Empire? When Kossuth received news of the chaos in Vienna, he immediately rushed to the parliament and began his famous February speech. I will conceptualize this paragraph first and write it tomorrow. At the same time, the Hungarian government also stated that it would support Pius IX's proposal. This heavy blow undoubtedly wanted to tear the Austrian Empire in half. At this time, the situation suddenly changed, and the collapse of the Orleans dynasty inspired countless perverts and careerists. They were waiting for this opportunity, and they were ready to overthrow Austria. However, Franz was also waiting for this opportunity, and his telegram was sent to Vienna on time. Madame Sophie's eyes widened when she saw the telegram, but she soon became relieved. On February 28, 1848, the third day after the collapse of the Orleans dynasty, the Austrian Empire announced that it would reject the unreasonable demands of Pius IX and formally declare war on the Papal States' aggression. The Habsburg family would use its power to re-evaluate this king. Is the Pope qualified? Chapter 854. Stubborn France. The Austrian Empire's declaration of war was too sudden. Under normal circumstances, such an important decision would not have been completed within a few days. First of all, the royal family passed this crazy resolution. Archduke Louis and Archduke Franz Karol were both people with no independent opinions. Under the strong pressure of Mrs. Sophie, they easily accepted the proposal to declare war on the Papal States. Secondly, the Austrian imperial government was also tortured a lot during this period. Count Raikkonen and Baron Kiel were already marginal figures, and they did not understand the core mechanism at the top. One of these two people was the Minister of Transport and the other was the Minister of Education. Both of them are typical technocrats. They have long been accustomed to the yes, yes, yes chat mode. Moreover, they are more concerned about the country than abroad, so they do not particularly understand the consequences of declaring war on the Papal States. Actually declaring war with the Papal States was a huge risk, as those countries that had previously claimed to support Pius IX would most likely intervene in the war if the 6 countries of France, Britain, Prussia, Spain, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire, which had previously issued a joint declaration, went to war with Austria. There would undoubtedly be a war that would affect the entire Europe. If this trend continues, it is possible that the Austrian Empire will be divided. But the reality is that France has just collapsed. Spain is mired in civil war. The Prussian government has been beaten to pieces by nationalists. And the Kingdom of Sardinia has begun to fear the power of the Papal States. As for the British, they were somewhat beyond their reach, and the Ottoman Empire had already declined. France felt that the French provisional government would immediately announce that it would not participate in any war and invalidate the Orleans dynasty's war threat. For the French interim government at this time, stabilizing the domestic situation was the top priority, rather than participating in the struggle for European hegemony. Although the royal party was excluded from the provisional government, and the Duchess of Orleans and the Duchess of Berry quietly left Paris, the Orthodox faction was still strong in the south, and the remaining forces of the Orleans faction were still active. France's rash dispatch of troops to Austria will cause great turmoil, and behind Austria is the German Confederation and the Holy Alliance. Then, when it comes to the root, the Papal States were actually the aggressor, and Austria was just forced to declare war. This fully applies to the mutual defense clauses of the two alliances. Judging from the previous battle records, the German Confederation had an advantage against France, and the French provisional government at this time was a mess, not to mention launching a large-scale war. They are now unable to provide food rations for the citizens of Paris. They originally wanted to imitate the Orleans dynasty and suck blood from the colonies. As a result, news of the collapse of the dynasty spread to the colonies, not to mention fully supporting the mainland. Basically all the governors began to think of independence. The two jackals, the British and the American, came over after smelling the smell of blood, but the two beasts still wanted to save some face, and they were willing to pay to buy it from the French provisional government. The US government was prepared to offer $3.5 million to purchase Texas, and the Americans thoughtfully left 2 states for the French. The problem is that both Arizona and New Mexico are inland and not connected to the ocean. If Texas is lost, these 2 states will be in vain. Moreover, there were hundreds of thousands of French people in Texas at this time, and taxes paid every year amounted to tens of millions of francs, and the French investment in the local area was calculated in the hundreds of millions. The British plan to directly take over all the French colonies as they did during the Napoleonic Wars, and the price is much higher than that of the Americans' £100 million. It can be seen that this is a very sincere figure, but of course the British are not so kind. They require 30 years to pay in full. This is a bit outrageous, because the French provisional government at this time did not know whether they could survive for 30 years. Although the Orleans dynasty was overthrown, the internal and external crisis did not disappear, but tended to intensify. After all, when Louis Philippe was still there, at least the external crises were not so serious. Therefore, France felt that the French provisional government should declare neutrality in the war between Austria and the Papal States as soon as possible. However, the reality is that the French provisional government is very stubborn. It keeps asking Austria to return the land of the Papal States, but it does not declare war or send troops. If the French provisional government really launches an attack on Austria, then France would not mind driving the reverse again for France. After all, there were discord within the French provisional government and there were a lot of potential enemies. France had at least 3 trump cards. There is really no need to be too polite with an enemy like this who likes to seek death, and France doesn't have time to do take eye with others at this time. If France does not retreat, the Spanish will naturally not retreat. Although Spain is in chaos at this time, Queen Regent Christiana and her daughter Isabella II are holding on to a sense of luck. That is, they can use this opportunity to divert domestic conflicts. They feel that Spain and Austria are not bordering anyway. As for the so-called war, Spain does not need money or soldiers, but if the Papal States wins, they must have a share of the credit. In fact, there is another reason, that is, the Spanish church is very influential, especially Isabella II, who is extremely superstitious. Sister Pathini and Father Claret were Isabella II's most valued mentors and advisors. And they were also members of the Society of Jesus, nominally under the leadership of the Pope. Sister Petrini and Father Claret naturally received orders from the Vatican. Although they hated the new Pope, war with Austria did not seem to affect their interests. William IV of Prussia mentioned earlier that he could not protect himself at this time and did not want to get involved in the dispute between Austria and the Papal States in the Rhine region. Due to the interaction of the Archbishop of Cologne and the German nationalists, William IV had lost control of the region. Prussia's high literacy rate also became a problem for them, because as long as someone wrote a few words on the city wall at night, it could trigger a riot the next day. Newspapers, books, and pamphlets had a much greater influence in Prussia than in Austria. Various ideas and doctrines continued to dye people into various colors, and the Prussian government was completely helpless. Similarly, industrialization has also created a group of people, the working class, whose organization and discipline are unmatched by farmers due to the high price of grain in the German Confederation. Over the years, land annexation in Prussia became more serious. A large number of landless peasants entered the factory, but in the current economy, workers were unemployed in large numbers, so they became the most terrible enemy of the Prussian government. The mainstream thinking at that time believed that poor people were the result of laziness, stupidity, and bad habits. Their poverty was God's punishment for them, which was actually providence. As the incarnation of God's will, the king with divine power cannot naturally help these poor people, so under the guidance of this kind of thinking, they are naturally opposed. At this time, 2 more people wrote some pamphlets and spread them in Berlin. William IV had a big head, and it was naturally impossible for him to go to a decisive battle with Austria at all costs. Chapter 855 Conspiracy. Although some staff believed that this was a good time to defeat the Austrian Empire in one fell swoop, William IV felt that continuing the rule of the Hohenzollern family was the top priority. The British were also hesitant to go to war, because at this time they were still studying how to appropriate the heritage of the Orleans dynasty. Choose this time to start a war with Austria. If you win, there is no doubt that the whole world will be filled with the flags of the British Empire. But what if it fails? So will the British Empire be counterattacked. Almost all the colonies of the Austrian Empire are difficult to chew, and the colonies of France are also difficult to deal with. What if France and Austria joined forces? At this time, the British domestic economy had collapsed. The Scots might take up arms at any time, and the Chartists were marching around to cause trouble. And will that idiot Pius IX continue to make any other unreasonable demands? However, John Russell felt that the British Empire could always be invincible if it stood alone overseas. It only needed to consider the relationship between costs and benefits. France's Texas, Austria's California, and Namibia are all colonies with excellent resources and relatively high development levels. They can be used to fill the economic crisis that Britain is experiencing at this time. Tranquebar in Tamil Nadu and Serampore in Calcutta were worries for the British in the Indian subcontinent. By solving them, they would be able to get rid of 2 worries. Not only could they continue to monopolize India, but they could also control the Eastern Sea route. Faced with such huge profits, who cannot be tempted? However, John Russell was still a thief. He felt that the Mediterranean fleet's combat power was somewhat insufficient at this time. In 1848, the total number of battleships in the Mediterranean fleet was as high as 35, including 1 first-class battleship, 3 second-class battleships, and 31 third-class battleships, so he decided to send 15 more battleships to the Mediterranean, including 2 of the latest paddle-wheel battleships. In this way, Britain could suppress the navies of Austria and France in the Mediterranean, and then attack the colonies of the 2 countries. John Russell did not intend to participate in the land battle. After all, the losses would be too great. Whether the Italians could unify Italy was actually not important to Britain. And he actually still has a bit of luck, that is, he hopes that France and Austria will go to war, so that the British Empire will be completely effortless. Palmerston scorned John Russell's plan, which he considered completely fanciful. 1,000 birds in the forest is worse than a bird in the hand. At this time, Britain should not go to war with France and Austria at the same time, because this would force the two European powers to unite. The final result of the dispute between the two sides was that John Russell agreed to postpone the start of the war by 1 month. In fact, it would take a month to deploy the fleet to the Mediterranean. As the younger brother of Britain, the Ottoman Empire naturally chose to keep up, but they also had their own selfish motives. After all, returning to the top was still very attractive to the Ottoman senior leaders headed by Megid. Especially when Milos Obranovic's plan looks very feasible, and the Belgrade defender has been replaced by a reckless man. Maybe they can accomplish that great goal at a very small cost. Moreover, Majid did not think that Belgrade would be the main battlefield. After all, this war was initiated by the Papal States, so the main battlefield should be in northern Italy. Carlo Alberto was a little wavering, because neither the expansion of the Papal State nor Austria's foothold in northern Italy was in the interests of the Kingdom of Sardinia. At this time, he only hopes that both sides can fight to the death, and then the Kingdom of Sardinia can pick up each. At this time, Carlo Alberto's most rational choice was to wait for the opportunity, but supporters of Mazzini and supporters of Pius IX had already begun to cause trouble in the Piedmont region. At this time, nationalism was not only present in Germany, but also blossomed across the European continent, and the Kingdom of Sardinia was no exception. Cesar Balbo, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia, felt that this was a good opportunity, because at this time, under the influence of Pius IX, the entire Italy was at war with Austria. And according to his intelligence, Vienna can almost be regarded as anarchy at this time, with disorder and leaderlessness. Therefore, as long as Carlo Alberto seizes the leadership of the war at this time, it will be equivalent to gaining the power to unify Italy. Fueled by nationalism and religious fanaticism, the people's enthusiasm for war against Austria was also very high. Cava wrote in his newspaper Renewal, "The high point of the Sardinian monarchy has arrived. Faced with the events in Lombardy and Vienna, hesitation, doubt, and delay are undesirable and the most disappointing policy. We are clear-headed people, accustomed to following the dictates of reason, rather than inner impulses, thinking word for word. We must now earnestly declare that our country, our government, and our king, have only one way out, war. If we fail to act in time, we will surely encounter misfortune." In this national enthusiasm, Carlo Alberto was driven to the battlefield. The addition of the Kingdom of Sardinia greatly ignited the enthusiasm of the Italians, but the situation was much worse than Pius IX expected. Because both the British and the Ottomans would declare war on the Austrian Empire in a month, Prussia actually chose to withdraw from the war. As for the reinforcement promised by the Spanish, Pius IX knew that it was a joke. Only Greater France still has some expectations. However, there is also an unexpected surprise, that is, the Hungarians are against Austria. The other party's civil strife will undoubtedly increase their chances of winning. At the same time, Landry Promy of the Polish Restoration Army also arrived in Rome. Landry Promy expressed his willingness to help, but Pius IX wanted to help the former restore Poland after unifying Italy. "Child, don't worry, I will not let God's people be ruled by heretics and hypocrites. It's just a matter of tithes, don't worry. Your Majesty the Pope, we Poles are the most trustworthy and know how to repay kindness. As long as we revive Poland, we are willing to repay the debts we have owed over the years, but it may take a little longer." Landry Promy said righteously, "It doesn't matter, children, as long as you still remember." Pius IX couldn't help but feel very relieved that finally a country's leader was willing to admit and repay the debt they owed. But at this time, Landry Promy suddenly felt a little embarrassed and hesitated to speak. How could this escape the eyes of Pius IX? He immediately asked, "My child, do you have anything to hide?" Landry Promy sighed, "Well, His Majesty the Pope is telling you that our Polish Restoration Army was dispersed back then, and I need a sum of money to reorganize the team." Pius IX showed a displeased look on his face and thought to himself, "Why should a Polish commander talk to me about this?" But Don't worry, His Majesty the Pope. Our Polish Restoration Army has 200 tons of gold hidden in Krakow. As soon as we recapture Krakow, we will immediately form a large army and go south. Okay. How much do you want? These 2 chapters have been overhauled. If there are any bugs in the plot, please notify me in time. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 856 Holy War. Landry Prome received the startup capital from Pius IX and embarked on a ship to France. At this time, Pope Pius IX's brother, Holy See Secretary of State Jotel, raised a question. Why did he go to France? The Pope said very happily, as expected of a professional. Jotel looked confused. He didn't understand. Shouldn't Poland go east? At this time, Pius IX spoke again. Commander, Landry is a thorn in the flesh of the Austrians. Crossing the Austrian border is naturally the fastest option, but it is not safe. Upon hearing this, Holy See Secretary of State Jotel couldn't help but sigh that his brother's wisdom was indeed unfathomable. However, at this time the Austrian Empire rejected the Papal State's proposal, and the 2 countries were actually at war. The Austrian Empire has a standing army of nearly 500,000 people, while the Papal State has a standing army of only 50,000. However, considering the actual situation, the number of soldiers receiving long-term military training may not exceed 5,000. In other aspects such as population, land area, financial revenue, weapons, and equipment, the Papal State is at a comprehensive disadvantage. And so far, no major country has declared war on Austria. The Kingdom of Sardinia has agreed to send troops, but it has to wait for a suitable time. Among the remaining Italian states, only the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies had strong military strength, but Ferdinand II seemed to intend to sit on the sidelines. If this continues, the Papal State's army must defeat 1 against 100 in order to win. The Secretary of State of the Holy See, Jotel, expressed his worries, but Pius IX was not worried. The latter pushed open the window, and a loud sound rushed into the house. Long live Pius IX. Long live Italy. Long live liberty. Long live the Constitution. The roaring sound like a tsunami swept through every cell in Kyanatel's body, and even gave him the urge to rush to the window and join the crowd. See, this is my confidence. With his back to the window, Pius IX seemed to be glowing like the sun, and the roar of the people behind him made him even more majestic. The Secretary of State of the Holy See, Jotel, knelt down unconsciously. I would like to hear the oracle. I will launch a holy war. I will drive the Austrians out of Italy. The French will be next. They must pay back the debt they owe. When Jotel, the Secretary of State of the Holy See, heard that the Pope was going to launch a war against the French, he was completely shocked. He was deeply impressed by his brother's ambition. It seemed that his family's future dominance of Italy would not be a dream. On March 2, 1848, Pope Pius IX held a swearing-in meeting for 100,000 people in Rome. The Papal State will dispatch an army of 150,000 to conquer Austria, led by Archbishop Cavaggi. Archbishop Cavaggi spent 10 years in penance at St. Bernard's Monastery, reading ancient and modern war history. After returning to the Vatican, he devoted himself to studying for another 30 years. He was also the legendary one-loser manifold teacher. Pius IX placed high hopes on him, hoping that he could regain the northern Italian region occupied by the Austrian Empire in one fell swoop, and gave him his blessing. Archbishop Cavaggi, who is 93 years old this year, compared the holy war launched by the Pope to the Crusades. Pius IX was overjoyed when he learned about it, and immediately declared that the Austrians are 100 times more barbaric than the Arabs. This move made Majid very hurt, and the Grand Vizier on the side also hesitated. Sultan, are we still on the side of the Papal State? Nonsense. We don't want to help the Pope, we want to take Belgrade back. The new Grand Vizier repeatedly said yes, but in his heart he was struggling with how to explain to the businessmen in the country. Fueled by religious and nationalist fervor, the Italians set out on their journey to northern Italy singing their war songs, weapons, Arpa issued under the banner of Asylums and from God Save Italy, long live Pius IX, long live Italy, long live unity. 3. At this time, Pius IX was not idle either. He wanted to summon all the monarchs in Italy and he wanted to unify Italy. The Jesuits became active again and declared, at this time, the world was declining, the princes were rising, and only one person was left. Only Pius IX was the only apostle of God on earth. Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Royal Palace of Naples. Without saying a word, Ferdinand II picked up his pistol and shot the Jesuit priest who was reading the edict of Pius IX in the head. However, before he could relieve his anger, he pulled out the pistol from the waist of his trusted minister Zancazialuo and fired 2 more shots and spit out 2 mouthfuls of phlegm before he finally vented his anger. Damn. Magic stick. You actually want to order me, Zancazialuo asked in a low voice. Your Majesty, are we still sending troops? Or have we never seen the envoys from the papal state at all? Ferdinand II sneered. Send troops. Why not send troops? Let me recruit all those nationalists, college students, constitutionalists and the lackeys of Pius IX into the army. Those who deserted the military service were killed on the spot in the name of protecting the 9th generation, and their property was confiscated. Don't they want to support the papal states in unifying Italy? I want to see how sincere their hearts are. Zancazialuo asked cautiously. Your Majesty, if we hand over the army to those traitors, won't we have even less chance of winning? It's okay if they lose, but if they win, wouldn't Italy belong to them? Ferdinando II said viciously. Win? Do you really think that the great powers are all paper tigers? Remember to let them go first. Tell them that the supplies will arrive later, and when they are far away, tell them to raise their own food and grass. I don't believe they can win. Your Majesty is brilliant. That's natural. It's 100 years too early for these bastards to want to kill me. The war between Pius IX and Austria doesn't matter, but these bastards can never return to my land. Do you understand? Understood. Understood. I'll do it now. Charlotte felt very happy when she thought about being able to ransack homes and exterminate families unscrupulously. She couldn't help but feel a little lighter on her feet. The small countries in central Italy governed by the Est system naturally had to respond to the call of Pius IX. The kings of these small countries had little power to begin with, and coupled with their long-term lack of ambition, they were basically taken away by the nationalists. The worst among them should be the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Since the death penalty was abolished, liberals bombed prisons as a result. This place has become a paradise for crime. Human life has become the cheapest consumable, and law, morality, and order have all become useless decorations. Banks, arsenals, and shops were all looted. Bridges, roads, and dams were destroyed one after another, and the largest mercury mine in Europe was blown up. In the name of jihad, the provisional government went around plundering people's fat and anointing, and captured young men and coolies, and surprisingly managed to amass an army of 200,000 people. But the one who was even more miserable was the Grand Duke of Parma, Carlo II of the Bourbon-Parma family. He originally wanted to make a big career out of both sides. After all, both France and Austria had to rely on him. Chapter 857 Seeking Death. However, things took a turn for the worse. Before Carlo II could complete the takeover of the Duchy of Parma, uprisings occurred one after another. He took over 3 constitutions and declared war on the Austrian Empire twice. What's worse is that the Austrians did not choose to give him this time, and the radicals in Parma were also ready to play it real. A small country with a population of only a few 100,000 actually sent out 50,000 troops to fight the Austrians. They also wanted themselves as the king to provide the money. Carlo II could only tearfully contribute 3 million francs of his original capital. However, the liberals were obviously dissatisfied, and they confiscated the property of the Bourbon-Parma family for military supplies. At this time, the kings of the small countries in central Italy couldn't help but realize a problem at the same time. If they continued like this, they would kill themselves sooner or later, and they all began to prepare to run away. Wissenstein Castle, also known as Whitestone, Tyrol, the provisional general staff of the Austrian Empire. Faced with the news that 450,000 Italian coalition troops were attacking northern Italy, France still seemed very calm and was still analyzing the behavioral Logic of the French provisional government. Point he could not understand why the French provisional government would make such a stupid and unreasonable decision, because going to war with Austria was completely inconsistent with their interests and situation. Point the Russian ambassador announced, as soon as he learned that France was about to declare war on Austria, that Russia would help Austria resist France's evil aggression. Point, although the Russian ambassador did not have much power, there were some things that Nicholas I had already acquiesced to, such as the war against revolutionary France. Point coincidentally, the German Confederation also announced almost at the same time that it would participate in the war against France. Point when the British saw that France was so stupid, they changed their strategy as soon as they learned the news. Congress collectively passed a war agreement against the French Revolution. Point Spain also changed its position and announced that it would join the anti-French alliance to fight against France. Point at the same time, a large-scale uprising broke out in France. The reason was that France temporarily claimed that the declaration of war on Austria was not for the Pope. Their behavior of being an enemy of the whole of Europe could not be thought of by the citizens other than treason. Point, in order to prevent the coming of war, the people of Paris once again built barricades on the streets. This time they wanted to overthrow the provisional government they had just put up. Point, when the French Republicans faced this desperate crisis, they could only think of letting one or a few people bear all the blame. Point, so the Republicans found a few scapegoats and announced that they would create a peace-loving France, although the great powers had put down their butcher's knife. This incident greatly damaged France's vitality and discredited the Republicans. France just wants to know what they are planning. Albrecht felt it was a pity because the militiamen in the Swiss region had captured all the cantons of Vaud and Geneva, and now that the French were no longer fighting, they had to return them. Point in fact, Franz was a little lucky that he returned it. Otherwise, the French would not be so easy to mess with at this time. They would have to pay compensation, but they would not have to cede the land, and they would not be able to control it at all. Franz, you don't seem to be worried at all about the 450,000 Italian coalition troops, Archduke. Carol asked with a smile. Grandpa. Carl, don't laugh. If you were worried, how could you laugh out loud? Franz's answer represented the view of most people in the entire combat conference room. The so-called Italian coalition was simply vulnerable. Point before the war began, the number of standing armies in the entire southern Italy would not exceed 100,000, so the source of these 450,000 troops was very clear, and almost all of them were new recruits. It is still unknown how much fighting power these people have, but can the Italian region, that has been hit by disasters for many years, surely be able to maintain the supplies of these hundreds of thousands of people? In fact, let alone the issue of sufficient supplies, how many people are needed just to transport supplies for a 450,000 strong army? And it's still in the complicated terrain of the mountainous areas of central Italy. Point, so this so-called coalition is a joke. The more people there are, the more ridiculous it becomes. On the other hand, the civil armed forces in northern Italy are a problem. Point neither Archduke Karol nor Albrecht took the so-called street fighting too seriously. In fact, barricades rarely appeared in Austria, and from a purely military perspective, they seemed easy to solve. Point, but it is impossible to fight so unscrupulously on one's own soil. After all, northern Italy is still the territory of the Austrian Empire. Point, if the land was wiped out with rockets and the city was burned with fire, as the father and son said, Austria would have no chance of unifying Italy. When will we start a war with the British? I have 9 ways to seize Crete. 9. The British Mediterranean fleet is just a fake. I can sink them to the bottom of the sea at any time. Friedrich seemed a little irritable at the moment. The British Mediterranean fleet was too annoying. As a naval commander of any Mediterranean country, no one wanted to kill them. Point, but most people can only think about it, and after Friedrich got the help of Franz, he really had the strength to annihilate all the enemies. However, the reality is that, even if the British Mediterranean fleet is completely annihilated, it will not be able to defeat Britain, and it will not help the situation, except that it will suffer greater revenge. Point, but the port of Durrës, the British wedge blocking the Adriatic Sea, is time to be removed. Point the British army here only had more than 3,000 people, and about 20 small boats. Although in theory it would not cause much trouble to the Austrian navy, Franz decided to destroy it from land just in case. The main reason is that it is uncertain whether the British will use these 24 small boats to lay mines directly on the water. The power of mines in this era is poor, but the anti-mine technology is even worse. Franz really didn't want to add too many variables to this war, and the surprise attack on the port of Durrës could also be blamed on the Ottomans to make them suspicious of each other. If the British really join the war, the target will definitely not be Austria itself. Fortunately, most of Austria's colonies are easy to defend and difficult to attack, or are of little value in the eyes of others. As for a developed colony like California, the British would probably lose their front teeth if they tried to attack it. Historically, although the British took the opportunity to inflict insults on Austria and propose that Austria exchange peace with northern Italy, they did not end it themselves. Franz felt that Britain, which was in deep economic crisis and plotting to colonize the French, would not declare war on Austria. However, the news coming back from London was different. John Russell seemed to be planning to become a fat man in one bite. Although it was somewhat unreasonable, Franz had to make plans in advance. Another reason for calling Friedrich over was that he was too reckless. Friedrich was different from Albrecht. The latter was brave and resourceful, while the former was always ready to live and die with his flagship. Moreover, Princess Sneaker, Friedrich's wife, was also a master at committing suicide. They actually went to watch the uprising hand in hand. Do you really not know who you want to defeat? In addition to the British, the Hungarians were also in big trouble. Chapter 858. The Kingdom of Sardinia joins the war. March 4, 1848, Milan. The entire street seemed unusually quiet. According to the informant, today would be the day of the Milan uprising. Marshal Radetzky declared martial law immediately, which was actually very painful for him personally. After all, the old Marshal loved this land deeply. In fact, Marshal Radetzky had dismissed quite a few Lombard officers and soldiers in the previous week. This is not only the kindness of the old Marshal to prevent fratricide, but also to eliminate unstable factors in the army. After all, the knives stabbed by one's own people are often the deepest. Children, take the money and leave with your families. At least don't be an enemy of the empire. This is not a request, but a piece of advice. As a senior senator and the main person in charge in the Lombardy region, Radetzky knew exactly what Franz was going to do, and he would resolutely implement the orders of the general staff. It's just that he didn't want to destroy this beautiful city unless he had to. However, as the alarm bells blared, fighting was imminent, and the people began to rush to the city hall and armory like crazy. On one side are the people with tricolor flags and crude weapons, and on the other side are the troops who have been preparing for a long time. The battle between the two sides can be imagined. In just 2 hours, blood and corpses covered the entire street. The narrow streets greatly limited the insurgents' numerical advantage, and at the same time infinitely amplified the power of artillery. No carbon-based creature can withstand the direct fire from the artillery at close range. The shot holes exploded above the heads of the crowd, and countless small steel balls were embedded in the human body under the influence of gunpowder. The wails and screams were endless, but this was just the beginning. Solid bullets, explosive bullets, and chain bullets completely destroyed the morale of the insurrectionists. The young soldier began to vomit, and the veteran comforted the new soldier while vomiting. If we don't fight back, we will be the ones who die. And I guarantee you, if they do it, we will be 10,000 times worse than those corpses. Faced with corpses all over the ground, the rebels in Milan were divided. Some felt that they should work together to continue to use powerful troops to destroy the enemy, while others felt that they should surrender as soon as possible because the gap between the two sides was too large. In fact, before the uprising began, the leader of the Republicans, Carlo Catania, opposed the armed uprising because the total number of Austrian troops inside and outside Milan was 50,000. And they were very poorly disciplined. Marshal Radetzky was not a mediocre person, and he had a high status in the minds of the soldiers. In addition, all commanding heights and traffic arteries in Milan have been occupied by the Austrian army. The rebels were led by a group of Jesuit priests and a few intellectuals who were dizzy at the sight of blood. The rebels cut bread most with knives. They had no weapons, and no qualified leaders. Carlo Catania felt that it was more reliable to convince the Austrians with words than to use force. However, other rebel leaders did not agree with his view. They felt that Catania was a capitulator and wanted to imprison him. In the end, it was the moderate leader Count Cassat who spoke out to prevent the Republicans from imprisoning their later leader. Cassat himself was a traditional nobleman. He made a bet between the Kingdom of Sardinia and Austria. His eldest son went to serve in the army of the Kingdom of Sardinia, and his second son went to study in Austria. This was not uncommon among traditional nobles, but the intrusion of Pius IX and the Republicans really disrupted his plans. Pius IX wanted to unify Italy, which was a crazy idea for Emperor Cassat, and the Republicans wanted independence, which was even more crazy for Emperor Cassat. But the survival wisdom of thousands of years as a nobleman told him that he should preserve his strength now. This is not only the strength of his own family, but also the strength of Lombardy. After all, a family is too insignificant in front of a country. Cassat's suggestion was to negotiate for peace. Although it sounded very naive, historically Cassat used the opportunity of peace negotiations to convince Heinrich O'Donnell, the governor of Lombardy, that the only option was to lift martial law to end this rebellion. When O'Donnell forced Radetsky's troops to leave, the Lombards launched a short but effective raid to capture the naive governor. After O'Donnell signed a series of humiliating treaties, he was imprisoned by the Lombards in a moldy wine cellar. When the Austrian Empire's army regained the city of Milan, people remembered the unfortunate governor. By this time, he had already turned into a mummy. In fact, O'Donnell cannot be entirely blamed for being too naive. After all, Count Cassat is an Austrian official, an Austrian noble, and the mayor of Milan. At this time, there should not be too many such young men in the northern Italian bureaucracy, but fortunately a general staff was established, and Franz even announced the order to enter the wartime mechanism directly through Vienna. This would at least ensure that Radetsky's army would not be subject to internal constraints. Secondly, the continued internal conflict between delegated officials and local officials would prevent the two sides from joining forces. As a result, the duplicitous identity of Count Cassat was exposed, and Governor O'Donnell naturally would not just rely on the other party's orders. In fact, Governor O'Donnell still had some integrity and intelligence. After seeing the other party's true face, he angrily scolded the other party and walked away. Governor O'Donnell knew that his ability was limited and could not cope with the coming crisis, so he resigned from his position as governor and prepared to go home to rest in his old age. For such a big noble, it is unrealistic to ask them to be loyal to the country. It is good to be able to do this without causing trouble to the country or taking the opportunity to make war fortune. These people have a great cause, and as long as they want, no country will refuse to accept them. Retiring early is still decent. If Governor O'Donnell makes the same mistake as in history, Franz doesn't mind helping him look decent. Earl O'Donnell's guard had a large number of insiders installed by Franz. This was not difficult for the latter, but the former could not do anything, even if he knew about it. Without Governor O'Donnell to hold him back, the Austrian army unilaterally crushed the Milanese rebels. However, due to the influence of religion and nationalism, anti-Austrian uprisings began to occur in other cities. Seeing the war in northern Italy, coupled with the shot in the arm of 450,000 Italian coalition troops, Carlo Alberto felt that it was time. On March 6, 1848, the Kingdom of Sardinia officially declared war on the Austrian Empire. Carlo Alberto knew very well that the Austrian Empire was not a fragile opponent. He knew that, even if it seemed that the Austrian Empire's rule in northern Italy was crumbling, he had to go all out to have any chance of winning. But at the same time, as an old bastard, he has already found a way out for himself. Carlo Alberto first installed a native liberal politician as Prime Minister Giovanni Gronzi, and then directly promulgated a emasculated version of the Constitution. The Constitution did little to combat autocracy, but it gave the state the right to impose additional war taxes and compulsory military service. Chapter 859 coming out. The Kingdom of Sardinia has only 50,000 standing troops, while the Austrian army in northern Italy has at least 150,000 troops. According to this ratio of troops, if the Kingdom of Sardinia plunged headlong into the battlefield in northern Italy, it would be a complete loss of lives. So Carlo Alberto wanted to change the military service system. After all, conscripts were much cheaper than recruiting soldiers, and it would be cheaper if they could die on the battlefield. The compulsory military service system also has another advantage for Carlo Alberto, that is, it can take the opportunity to eliminate those unstable factors: young Italy, Carbonari, Mazzini, nationalists, university students, unemployed workers, landless peasants, vagabonds, radical aristocrats. Constitutionalists. Carlo Alberto would not send all his cronies to die like Pius IX. He would send those who might affect his rule to the battlefield. However, Carlo Alberto would not ignore the outcome of the war, so he sent his two strongest generals, Lieutenant General Eusebio and Lieutenant General Ettore di San. As Lieutenant General Eusebio had participated in the anti-French war and was very senior, but had no actual achievements, Lieutenant General Ettore di San is a young and energetic young man who is very enthusiastic about dynastic wars. Carlo Alberto knew that his level was limited, so he found two retired French officers as his staff. The three of them thought it was too dangerous to put all their eggs in one basket, so they decided to split into two groups. One group, led by Lieutenant General Eusebio, crossed the Ticino River and went straight to Milan, and the other group, led by Lieutenant General Ettore di San, attacked from Genoa through the Ligurian Pass and directly into the Austrian Po River defense line. As long as the rebels in Milan can hold back Radetzky, then the King of Sardinia's technique of dividing and attacking together can encircle the main force of the Austrian Empire in northern Italy. Under the combination of internal and external cooperation, there will be no more wars south of the Alps. Tyrol, on the other hand, before the Kingdom of Sardinia officially declared war, France had already received news that Carlo Alberto was going to join the war. This news is not surprising, because the abnormal behavior of Queen Anna's lover Baron Sloat has given France enough warning. Baron Sloat has been collecting information about the Austrian army since the war started. However, since the general staff is located in Tyrol, he can only get the information through the Ministry of War. It was not a very smart idea to directly shut him out, so France deliberately let people be bribed by Baron Sloat. However, this information was sometimes true and false, and even some were true among the false, and some were false among the true. Therefore, most of the news that Carlo Alberto knew was what France wanted him to know. As for Baron Sloat, France will not let him go easily. After all, the revenge of two assassinations has not been avenged. Due to the existence of telegraph lines, the general staff could directly issue orders to the command system at the Milan and Venice levels. Franz's order sounded strange to the ears of others on the general staff: evacuate. There are more than 500,000 civilians of other ethnic groups in northern Italy, and the vast majority of them come here to make a living and do business. In addition, in northern Italy, except for a few large industrial and commercial cities and some areas with extreme religious fanaticism, 80% of Italians did not participate in the rebellion at this time. Farmers even came to the city to sell things as usual, and some able-bodied people hoped to get jobs like digging trenches. A vast majority of people were indifferent to the so-called jihad, and the immigrants from southern Italy even scorned the devil Pius IX and the kings under him. Now there is no guarantee that no inch of territory will be lost, so protecting civilians has become the top priority. France prepared to relocate the war refugees to the Quatre Fortress, the Venetian coastal city belt, the area north of the Alps, and even the Hungarian plains. He wanted to take this opportunity to solve the problem of excessive gathering of Italians in the country. In terms of density alone, the Italian population in northern Italy is much denser than the German population in Bohemia and Vienna. If it were not for the opportunity of war, it would be a fool's errand to relocate so many people in normal times. In fact, most people still would not choose to abandon their homes and flee to some safer areas. After all, this land has changed hands many times, but those who are regarded as foreign nationalities by Italians must migrate, because nationalism actually amplifies the hatred between ethnic groups infinitely. For safety reasons, this group of people will be very willing to follow the Austrian army into the designated safe area. If something bad happens later, Austrian officials will have every reason to drive the latecomers to other areas. However, Franz's behavior seemed too weird in the eyes of people at the time. After all, no one thought that killing a few people in a battle would do anything. In fact, Franz didn't know how to explain it. This time was actually similar to the 30 Years' War. If it was not controlled, it would be possible to bleed and leave people drifting point. Although there were slight differences among the general staff on the two issues of evacuation of overseas Chinese and protection of civilians, everyone still reached a consensus on the two top priorities of consolidating the Po River defense line and stabilizing the situation in Venice Point, no matter how depleted the coalition forces in northern Italy were. They still numbered more than 400,000 people, and the strength of the few regiments in the outpost fortress at this time was not enough in any case. This matter will naturally fall on Albrecht. Although defensive warfare is not his specialty, this battle will inevitably be very fierce and protracted. Only the young and powerful Archduke Albrecht can handle it. The Austrian Empire's military configuration at this time is Italy 150,000, Salzburg 50,000, Vienna 100,000, Galicia 100,000, Bohemia 50,000, Belgrade 50,000. The Hungarian local defense force Austria has no right to mobilize, and small troops were stationed at various forts. In fact, Austria cannot mobilize the troops in the crown territory of St. Stephen, but the central government of the empire has the power to appoint and remove personnel, so there is still some room for maneuver, such as letting Gelle, Anton von Pinkley and other pro-Austrian forces send on stage. At this time, Albrecht could only mobilize troops from various military districts. The main force was naturally the border guards from Galicia, but the number of troops mobilized to guard against Prussia and Russia was still limited. Therefore, he had to fight with less than 50,000 troops against the coming 450,000 Papal State troops. Franz will also take action. He must put down the rebellion before Venice falls, and then pick up the pieces and fully support Albrecht's Po River defense line. This situation was entirely the result of General Alois Palffy, considered the best graduate of the military academy ever. He entered the military academy at the age of 8 and graduated at the age of 12. He was proficient in all tactics such as artillery, cavalry, and infantry. After graduation, he directly served as a lecturer at the Military Academy, the highest military academy in the Austrian Empire, responsible for teaching battle theory, war science, and artillery studies and a series of important subjects. He has visited many foreign countries and received awards from monarchs of various countries. His medals and certificates can fill an entire room, and his honorary titles can fill 2 pages. However, it was such a theoretically invincible killer who destroyed 50,000 garrison troops in Venetia in 3 days, forcing Franz to take action himself. Chapter 860, The Era of Lean Years. In addition to destroying the general reserves in Venetia, Alois Palffy succeeded in the fall of Vicenza, one of the 4 fortresses, and this group of rebels was unusual. They blew up nearby railways and bridges at the first opportunity, so Franz could only assemble his troops in Verona, which was farther away. Franz did not plan to attack the city. He planned to bypass Vicenza and go straight to Venice. At this time, there were still 20,000 garrison troops and more than 2,000 naval soldiers in Venice. Moreover, there are more than 100 forts, large and small, outside the city of Venice, and their defensive capabilities are extremely high. Theoretically speaking, this kind of fortified city cannot be conquered by the rebel army that does not even have artillery, but wherever there is a sleeping dragon, there must be a phoenix chick. At this time, the garrison commander of Venice city is the famous Trash Fernand in the Austrian Imperial army. This kind of god who can put Garibaldi away 10,000 to 800 might actually lose Venice. The reason why Fernand Lizzi and Alois Palffy could appear in the battle sequence of the Austrian army was entirely due to the power of their families, the result of the imperial government's compromise after a multi-party game. Both of them actually have extraordinary resumes. This is the result of the family's creation of gods. The older the family, the more they like to artificially create some idols for the world to worship. Perfect characters help them consolidate their status. This is why so many people in power dismiss Franz's deeds. Franz only brought his own Royal Dragoon Regiment and the guards training in Tyrol. The total number was only more than 5,000, followed by a supply force of the same number. Although the number of people is not large, the advantage is that they are well trained and well equipped, and everyone can ride 2 horses each. Moreover, all members are equipped with the latest lever-action rifles, and the firepower output per unit time can completely crush a traditional army of 30,000 people. In addition, there are new lightweight rodless spinning rockets, grenades, wooden handle grenades, smoke grenades, shotguns, etc. If it were an encounter in the wild, Franz believed that, even if he couldn't win a big victory, escaping unscathed would not be a problem. In fact, he was a little curious about what kind of rebel army directly dispersed the 50,000 troops of the Austrian Empire. If it was said that the Venetian rebels could annihilate the 50,000 strong Austrian Empire army in a few days, even if the Sequoia army came, Franz would not believe it. To borrow a sentence from Bright Sword, even 50,000 pigs could not be caught in 3 days. The result was completely different from Franz's guess. Austrian troops were defeated everywhere along the way. These people not only have weapons, but also several days of dry food, and some teams even have complete organizations. They just didn't know where the officers were. These soldiers were originally scattered throughout Venetia. After the Papal State officially declared war, they were gathered by Alois Parfi and used as a mobile force. Afterwards, rebellions broke out in Felta and Malestica, and Alois Parfetti's army moved north. They first arrived at Malestica, but the rebels had already fled when the army arrived. Then they continued north to Felta, but they failed again. Alois Parfi prepared to retreat to Verona, but during his absence a rebellion broke out in the fortress of Verona, which had already changed hands. General Alois Parfi immediately ordered a storming of the Verona fortress. As a result, the soldiers were unable to attack the fortified city without heavy weapons. In desperation, Alois Parfi planned to go to Malaysia to rest for a while, and then transfer some heavy artillery from Venice. As a result, when they arrived at Malastica, the city had been occupied by the rebels. The exhausted army could no longer fight, so they had no choice but to continue heading north. However, Felta had also been occupied by the rebels, and they had no choice but to besiege Felta. But when they woke up the next day, they found that all the officers were missing. Without a leader, these armies from different regions naturally collapsed. Although it is very annoying, it is good news for Franz. It seems that there is no supernatural power, otherwise he would really be unable to bear the meteorites falling from the sky. Moreover, these broken troops actually still retain considerable combat effectiveness, and those whose formations have not been broken up can be used directly. At this time, Franz discovered a talent, a sergeant from Slovenia. The latter stole a costume from a theater and ended up gathering thousands of troops. If he hadn't encountered Franz's team, maybe this bluffing guy could have created an army. And the most important thing is that the sergeant did not use the power in his hands to mess around, but just gathered the troops to withdraw to Venice, which greatly increased Franz's favor with him. After all, Franz has seen too many guys who do whatever they want with a little power in their hands. Especially the recent escape of two senior officers made him very angry. Prince Eugen is an Italian from France, Wallenstein is a down-and-out Czech mercenary, and what about a general, trained entirely by Austria? There is a historical reason why the Austrian Empire has never been able to cultivate outstanding generals. This group of cadavers has occupied important positions in the army for hundreds of years. The only war general born and raised in Austria was Archduke Karol, but since he was a member of the royal family, he would not be subject to the random command of those old nobles. Archduke Karol was just a young boy when he first entered the battlefield. You can say that he was a war genius, but from the side it further highlighted the incompetence of the Austrian aristocratic bureaucracy. The anti-French war once created a group of military talents for Austria, but now it has reached a period of decline. For example, Marshal Radetzky, Archduke Karol and others have reached the age of burial, while the young men such as Gablenz and Benedek are still relatively young. Especially since Benedek is from a civilian background, his path to promotion will be even more difficult. So at this time, Franz was very happy to discover the talent at the bottom. At least the sergeant did not flee, or be at a loss like other officers. At least he had organizational skills. Franz was going to ask a major of the Royal Dragoons to help and give them a Habsburg flag. This should be enough for them to gather the defeated troops. The Po River defense line at this time is very fragile. If the Italian coalition forces really attack, this may be a good thing for the Austrian Empire. After all, military discipline in this era is not guaranteed at all. As long as they sack a few villages or cities, Pius IX's right to speak will be gone. The so-called Holy War will become a joke, like the Crusaders attacking Constantinople. Moreover, the Austrian side can completely retreat into the solid four-corner fortresses. Historically, Radetzky used these fortresses to delay the Italian coalition forces, including the Kingdom of Sardinia. For half a year Franz had previously reinforced these fortresses just in case, but at this time northern Italy was still Austrian territory. Franz did not want to repeat the mistakes of the past. The broken troops wandering in Venetia, plus Albrecht's 50,000 reinforcement, and the terrain advantage of the Po River should be able to steadily resist the Italian coalition's front. Now Franz's only purpose is to rush to Venice and take over the city's defense before problems arise in the city. Chapter 861, Entering the City. In fact, the reason why it is impossible to figure out the number of rebels is not that there is too little information, but that there is too much information sent back, making it impossible to distinguish between true and false. When Franz's troops arrived at the gates of Venice, an ominous premonition enveloped his heart. The gates of the huge Venice city were closed, but there was not a single soldier on the wall. Colonel Monta sent someone to call the door, but there was no answer. After calling several times, blast the city gate open, Franz said firmly. But, Your Excellency, how can we defend the city gate if we blow it up? Colonel Monta was in trouble at this time, because they not only had to capture the city of Venice, but also had to hold it with an unknown number of rebels. Although the city gate of Venice is very thick and reinforced with steel bars, Colonel Monta really has a way to open it at this time. Since Franz had come up with nitroglycerine very early, the Weapons Development Bureau had also come up with corresponding weapons, but the passivation was not very successful. Although this kind of early detonator is powerful, it is also very dangerous. The person carrying it must stay away from the team. The detonator made of nitroglycerine is extremely unstable and is used as a weapon, so it is fully capable of destroying an entire transport team. Its actual power is even greater than TNT, which is known to later generations. When 1 kilogram of nitroglycerine explodes, it can generate 715 L of gaseous material, and the heat released during the explosion. According to the data of different researchers, it is 6.082 x 103 6.178 kJ. When water is in gaseous state, at this time, the explosion temperature reaches a maximum of about 3980 deg.C and the pressure is about 9000 x 105 bar. This power is more than 30 times that of black powder. Even reinforced concrete cannot withstand the explosion of a 5 kilogram detonator, let alone the wooden structure in front of you covered with iron steel plates. My men can climb up and open the gate inside, Colonel Monta suggested, but Franz didn't want to hear it. Execute the order. We don't have time to waste here. Yes. Seeing that Franz had made up his mind, Colonel Monta immediately ordered the city gate to be blown up. With a loud bang, the city gate, which could withstand direct fire from an 18-pounder gun, was blown away. The remaining wood chips directly beat the people behind the door into pieces. Fragmented. Franz didn't know who they were, but after Franz and his party revealed their identities, they still pretended to be dead and hid behind the door with weapons in their hands. It seemed that they deserved to die. The two cavalrymen at the front rushed to the city hall carrying the Austrian military flag and the flag of the Habsburg family. Franz's order was, anyone who tries to stop us will be killed without mercy. However, the entire street was surprisingly empty, and no fighting took place. At this time, the scout reported that he had caught a sneaky man. Before Franz could speak, the man shook his head like a rattle. I do not know anything. Franz took out his pistol and shot the man in the left leg. Oh God. The man hugged his leg and shouted in pain, and Franz pointed the gun at his other leg expressionlessly. My name is Marcello. I serve Mr. Manning, and now Mr. Manning is forcing General Leakey to hand over his military power. The two sides have already discussed it, but General Leakey asked that the city be handed over to the Citizens Committee after dinner. Marcello immediately poured out everything he knew. Colonel Monta and Bordeaux looked happy, but Franz remained expressionless. Take him down and treat him. We will rush to the city hall immediately. When Monta and Bordeaux heard that General Leakey would hand over the city after dinner, they were relieved. After all, there were still 2 hours before sunset point. There are still 20,000 troops in Venice, and the troops they bring are enough to wipe out the rebellion in the city point. The city of Venice not only has a high city and a deep pool with many artillery, but also the most critical port and fleet. Even if it cannot be defeated, retreating will not be a problem point, but Franz felt that Monter and Bordeaux were too optimistic. Although General Leakey was incompetent, it was too hasty to directly hand over the city, and it was possible that most of the 20,000 troops were Italians. In fact, the reason why the rebellion was difficult to suppress was precisely because many of the rebels were originally Austrian soldiers. They were very familiar with the Austrian army's tactics, so they were able to win by surprise. Point Venice, City Hall. Point Daniel Manin was a very good orator, and he succeeded in convincing Leakey and his army that there were 100,000 rebels in Venice, that Milan had fallen, that Radetzky was finished, and that the Papal States where the army had crossed the Po River and was heading straight for Venice Point. But Daniel Manin was not lying at all. Alois Parfy and his army were indeed dispersed. Point Daniel Manin has convinced nearly half of Leakey's troops to join his civil guard and will give them official positions on the Citizens' Council. Point the reason why General Fernando Lizzi did not hand over the city to Daniel Manin at this time was not because the former insisted on having dinner, but it was El Pacino Corleone and his peer brotherhood, as well as the Venetian navy. Point although Archduke Friedrich had followed Franz's advice and moved the naval headquarters to Trieste, there was still a naval branch and naval sanatorium and other facilities in the Venice area. Point I have to say that these gangsters and gangster-like sailors were still very loyal at this time. They defended the harbor area, and with the support of naval heavy artillery, the rebel attack was a joke. Point for this reason, Daniel Manin had to convince Fernando Rizzi, the supreme commander of the city of Venice, to hand over all the Venetian forts to the rebels, because once Fernando Lizzi dies, Rear Admiral of the Navy will become the highest commander in the entire city. Point if Major General Admila guards these forts, no matter how many rebel troops Daniel Manin sends, it will be useless. The only ones that could sink the warships in the port were the coastal defense guns. As the sun set, the sound of horse hooves suddenly sounded. Archduke Franz is here. The army of the Austrian Empire is here. We are victorious. A group of cavalrymen with loud voices shouted in both German and German, which confused the rebels and those who were preparing to surrender. Those soldiers who did not want to surrender were ecstatic, and the cavalry passed through the half joyful half confused crowd. Point Fernando Lizzi also heard the shouts outside. The hesitation, he had just opened the window, disappeared, and he shouted excitedly, "Long live the Austrian Empire." Boom. A shot rang out. Fernando Lizzi, the commander of the Venetian city defense army, fell forward in disbelief, fell out of the window, and fell heavily to the ground. Listen. They are lying. Kill all those Austrians. Close the city gates. The heavenly army of the Papal States will arrive tomorrow. Daniel Manin roared angrily. This was the only way he could think of to save the defeat at this time. He didn't want to be a prisoner anymore. Sorry for coming home late. I haven't eaten yet. Chapter 862 Street Fighting. Daniel Manin's judgment was not wrong. The people who came to Venice at this time were indeed not the main force of Austria, but he himself did not believe his judgment. Ironically enough, the fortified city of Verona fell again. By chance, a defeated Austrian army circled back to Verona. As a result, they were treated as reinforcement by the rebels in the city under the cover of night. After a melee, this defeated army miraculously recaptured Verona. But the news that Daniel Manin received was not a defeated army, but tens of thousands of Austrian allied troops who directly opened the door and killed everyone on sight. The rebels had no choice but to retreat. But he was not the most panicked person in Venice at this time. The rebellious officers and high-ranking rebels were more panicked than Daniel Manin. The emotions of officers are very easily contagious to soldiers, especially panic and anxiety that spread faster. In addition, the vanguard sent by Franz shouted nonsense before, and with the sound of the gunshot, the crowd in the square began to look at each other with strange eyes. After a brief stunned state. After a brief and terrifying silence, both sides erupted into horrifying roars. The rebels and Austrian soldiers in the square picked up all the items that could be used as weapons and rushed to the opposite side. Guns, swords, fists, and even teeth. Everyone tried their best to kill each other. The vanguard sent by Franz was a little confused because they didn't know what was happening. The group suddenly pointed their cannons at the crowd and started killing each other. At this point, their mission has been completed, and all that remains is how to escape from this hell on earth. Franz's cavalry was very experienced, and it was obvious that there was no way back in the alleyway filled with people. Their only way to survive was to rush forward. However, in Daniel Manin's eyes, he wanted to launch a desperate charge against him and came after him. As a result, the leader of the rebel army who had been commanding Ruoding just now turned into a deserter in an instant. Daniel Manin screamed for people to protect him, but he turned out to be a bit sentimental. The cavalrymen immediately walked away when they saw the opportunity to escape, but the frightened Daniel Manin still did not dare to walk out of the city hall. In fact, it is unreasonable for the cavalry to charge the city hall, let alone the city hall surrounded by rioters. It is not a desperate fight, but a pure death. On the other side of the city, because he didn't know what was going on near the city hall, Franz decided to take the safest way forward and clean up the carpet along the way. In a frontal battle, Franz's 5,000 men completely crushed the rebels, but if they were ambushed, that might be a problem. He still has methods for simple street fighting. In fact, after many experiments, heavy anti-explosion shields and heavy body armor have proven to be ineffective. In the end, Major General Vincent Augustine adopted the design of an explosion-proof vehicle. Yes, it was still the same style as Kejigwang and Huss. It just underwent some modernization, making it relatively lightweight, smaller, and had small tires. However, the early explosion-proof vehicles were still very strange. They were actually called explosion-proof vehicles, but to be precise, they were explosion-proof trolleys. In order to facilitate advancement at the beginning of the design, the Austrian military engineers also thoughtfully designed the handrails. They really put the word propulsion into practice. Major General was the highest military rank that Franz could help him obtain. At that time, technical personnel were indeed not taken seriously. At this time, the explosion-proof trolley had a 120 kg giant shield mounted on the chassis. Soldiers could hide behind the shield and shoot, and then use the handrails to control the direction. This huge shield protects soldiers from the threat of rifles, and can withstand a considerable amount of damage from black powder explosives. Although it looks a bit weird and bulky, it is actually surprisingly useful in street fighting. At least the soldiers no longer have to be afraid of barricades. In fact, the barricades were of little use to the army in Franz's hands. Pirn was a warrior of the Venetian Republic. Temporarily, and he had great confidence in their barricades, as no one had been able to break them in decades. Neither the French, nor the British, nor the Austrians. Pirn and the other insurgents confidently awaited the arrival of the enemy behind their barricades of furniture and rags, but generally speaking, they like to put the enemy closer before hitting them, so that the hit rate can be higher. And the opponent can't hit them anyway, so it doesn't matter whether they are in danger or not. However, this time it was different from usual. The Austrian soldiers hid behind their shields. The shields were surprisingly hard and bullets could not penetrate them at all, but fortunately we still have barricades. Pirnit's voice represented the thoughts of most people behind the barricade, but soon one after another wooden handle grenades were thrown over the barricade. Hand grenades have been away from the battlefield for a long time. In the traditional sense, hand grenades are shaped like watermelons, which resemble the iron mines of later generations. However, no matter how stupid you are, you can feel the danger when this new and strange thing that you have never seen before starts to make a noise and emit white smoke. But it was too late. As grenades exploded one after another, the screams of countless people came from behind the barricade. But no one showed mercy to them, and they were greeted with more grenades. In fact, Franz was already merciful. If Colonel Monte's plan was followed, the soldiers would stand on the commanding heights and directly attack the crowd with rockets. The latter didn't care how many people were killed or how many rooms were burned. He simply wanted to solve the problem from a military perspective. It was impossible for Franz not to consider this, but he was not as anxious as when he first entered the city. After all, the existence of the rebels had been confirmed, and the two sides had even exchanged fire. There is no need to consider other situations now. Just defeat the enemy. The rebels behind the barricade were being unilaterally massacred by elite regular troops. In addition to wooden-handled grenades, Franz also prepared a large number of other types of projectile weapons, so these barricades actually trapped the rebel soldiers, because they thought they would be safe hiding behind the barricades. But the furniture could not save them at all, but would become a stumbling block for them when escaping. Piernet was now pinned under the barricade, and a heavy cabinet smashed half of his face. Piernet, unable to move, looked at the people running in all directions, and screamed in terror. His consciousness was fading, and he could no longer hear the sounds around him. Piernet was a worker in a leather factory. One day his boss suddenly came to him and told him that there was going to be a war. As long as there was a war, even a poor country boy like him would have the opportunity to marry the daughter of a wealthy businessman and live in a big villa by the sea. After that, those veterans began to preach that war was glorious and sacred. It seemed that, as long as the war started, everything would be fine. But the reality is that war is hell. There are explosions one after another, and broken limbs and broken arms are everywhere. Fortunately, the grenades do not have the special flame effects in the movies. Otherwise, once the wooden barricades burn, I'm afraid that the whole area will be destroyed. Neighborhoods will be engulfed in flames. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 863 Charge. As the cry broke out, the Austrian soldiers began to cross the barricade. Someone saw Piernet trapped under the barricade. The soldier hesitated for about a second and raised the muzzle of his gun to free him. Franz walked through the streets covered with corpses and blood, and he knew that this was just the beginning. The barricades in Venice did not cause Franz too much trouble. Whether it was queuing to shoot or cracking turtle shells, it was not a problem for his troops. The advantages of lever-action rifles over old-fashioned muzzle-loading muskets, even flintlock guns and matchlock guns, are extremely obvious. This can be seen from the ratio of casualties on both sides. The Austrian army suffered less than 50 casualties for more than an hour after the battle started, while before there were more than 500 rebel corpses in a street. The fighting on the periphery soon reached the ears of Daniel Manin of the city hall. The battle in the city square had just ended, but this did not mean that he won, but that the loyalist soldiers temporarily retreated back to the military camp. What now faces Daniel Manin is a dilemma: continue to attack the remaining loyalists, or eliminate the new force. At this time, there are three groups of forces loyal to Austria in Venice. If they are really gathered in one place, the rebels will not have to play. Among these three forces, only Franz's reinforcement have no geographical advantage, and if the intelligence is true and Franz is in the army, Daniel Manin feels that, as long as he catches Franz's reckless archduke, this will the war is over. Citizens, we are descendants of the Roman conquerors. We are God's chosen people. Fight for freedom and God. We must not surrender. Long live freedom. Long live Pius IX. The sparse shouts in the square made Daniel Manin very unhappy, especially the words "Long live Pius IX." The old bastard only knew how to collect tithes, which in his opinion was simply disgusting. In fact, if Franz can be caught this time, Daniel Manin is ready to try his hand at becoming the governor of Wisny. Thinking of this, he became energetic again and shouted, "Ah! Great Venice is now in an unprecedented crisis. The evil Austrians do not want us to be independent. For this they sent their evil army and that evil prince, but this is also our opportunity. Our military strength is 10 times this. As long as we capture their evil commander, then we will win this war." Daniel Manin's analysis cannot arouse people's interest at all. At this time, the square is in a mess, with a large number of corpses left unattended, and many dying people pleading. At this time Daniel Manin used his unique trick. The bounty for killing an Austrian soldier is 100 florins. Whoever catches Franz Joseph will be rewarded 10,000 florins. As the saying goes, if you are rewarded with a big reward, there must be a brave man. But this time there are very few candidates, because the reward he promised last time has not been given yet. In desperation, Daniel Manin asked the war team to drive the crowd towards the battlefield. At this time, the rebel army, including the soldiers who defected from Austria, totaled less than 20,000. But Daniel Manin and the rebel leader Fabio are still confident. After all, according to the latest news, Austria's reinforcement of less than 5,000 people. Soon the leading troops of both sides exchanged fire, and huge explosions occurred one after another, which made Daniel Manon a little uneasy. His feelings stemmed from the previous attack on the port area. At first, Wisna's rebel army was unstoppable, but fell apart under the attack of naval guns in the port area. The effect of hundreds of naval guns firing at the same time was simply devastating. At that time, Daniel Manon suddenly discovered that he was also a mortal. That's why he wanted to use the Austrians' help to get rid of the Austrian navy, but a series of accidents backfired and made him a gambler. That's right, Daniel Manon is now focusing everything on being able to quickly capture France and then use hostages to force the Austrian army to submit. Don't worry, Mr. Manon. The Austrians have been blocked by us in the barricades. It is only a matter of time before they surrender. Fabio, the former deputy commander of the Austrian city of Wisny, said that after serving in the Austrian army for more than 30 years, he was very clear about the Austrian army's tactics at this time. The Austrian army still used the offensive tactics of the Napoleonic period, and they would continue to attack as long as they had a chance. But what General Fabio didn't know was that Franz was very aware of the future trend of defending the strong and attacking the weak. The latter didn't care whether he was on the defensive, he only knew that his side had the advantage. The Venetian rebels have been attacking frantically. Although France can directly push the front back, it would be better to shrink a little if fewer people can be killed. So the Austrian army returned to the barricades and used obstacles to block the rebel attack. However, it was Franz's abnormal strategy that gave General Fabio the illusion that the Austrians were in trouble and they were about to withdraw. At this time, Fabio even made the decision to divide his troops despite insufficient troops, just because he was afraid of letting the big fish Franz go. However, the gap in training and weapons soon became apparent. The rebel soldiers rushed forward in waves and were harvested by various explosives and bullets in just 1 hour. Fabio's soldiers died in more numbers than in the past half-month. Bordeaux actually wanted to find a place for Franz to drink tea, but the latter was not that kind of traditional aristocrat. He didn't want to pretend to be calm, nor did he want to go to the front line to cause trouble. He just found a relatively clean room to quiet down. Observe. The situation was completely one-sided. As long as the rebels passed the corner, they would be shot dead by Austrian soldiers. At this time, the Austrian army, as the defender, not only occupied key nodes, but the snipers also occupied almost all commanding heights. The rebels obviously had no countermeasures, and their firepower was also crushed by the Austrian army. France's light cavalry had much stronger firepower than the Venetian rebels, but even so, the opponent still adopted an offensive strategy, which made Franz conclude that the opponent's commander must be a mediocre person. In fact, this view is not entirely correct, because at this time, Napoleonic offensive tactics were popular in the military world, and not everyone could do it if they wanted to violate the authoritative template. Seeing that the place was already covered with a layer of corpses, Franz felt that the time had come to counterattack, and he did not want to give the opposing commander a chance to reflect, attack, destroy them in one fell swoop. We will regain Venice today. Franz's words received an enthusiastic response from senior officers such as Colonel Monta. Yes, long live the Austrian Empire, Colonel. Monta put the whistle to his mouth and took a deep breath. A sharp whistle sounded, and all the soldiers began to fix their bayonets. The rocket launchers and grenadiers, soldiers who used grenade launchers on the side, fired all their ammunition as quickly as possible. Smoke filled the air, and then loud shouts of death rang out, and the Austrian army began to charge. Chapter 864 Giovanni. In fact, the officers and soldiers of the Royal Dragoons had been holding their breath for a long time. They could only dismount and fight on foot in such streets, and it was enough to hold their breath. In order to reduce casualties, Franz even asked the regular troops to hide behind the barricades. This was understandable in his opinion. After all, in the eyes of future generations, it was not only not embarrassing, but also quite satisfying to allow the opponent to take the initiative to kill people. But the soldiers at the time didn't think so, at least those who had been indoctrinated with some so-called ideas of honor since childhood. They just felt that it was too embarrassing to be suppressed by the militia point at this moment. They were already impatient with waiting. Show the Italians our courage, Colonel. Monta rolled up his sleeves and pulled out his saber, and then Franz pushed him back to his seat. How can any command lead the charge, Your Highness? The competition now is about which side has the highest morale. As long as we overwhelm them, even if I die, the other side will definitely lose. And aren't you still here? Colonel Monta tried to explain the rationality of his behavior, which made Franz helpless. How dare I promote you? If you do this, you want to promote me? Colonel Monta asked in surprise. That's not the point, okay? I'm telling you not to die. Franz was no longer able to complain about the other person's brain circuit. On the other hand, on the battlefield, hand-to-hand combat was more disadvantageous than rifle fire. The most important thing was that the Venetian uprising and rebels had not only been suppressed by the firepower of the Austrian army, but their morale was already on the verge of collapse. What's even worse is that, although they were shooting at the Austrian troops hiding behind the barricades, they couldn't be cowed in terms of momentum, so most of them had just fired one round at this time point in this era. A rifle would take more than 20 seconds even for a skilled shooter, let alone these militiamen and miscellaneous fish. Therefore, the rifles in their hands are not even as good as fire sticks. Coupled with the gap in training and physical fitness between the two sides, the only result of such a hand-to-hand battle is to be unilaterally massacred. 99% of the rebels have not received formal bayonet and fighting training, and the training level of Fabio's rebels as Fernando Liz's troops will naturally not be much higher. What's more important is that the two sides came into contact before most people had time to attach their bayonets. With the sound of bayonets piercing flesh, the rebel soldiers screamed pitifully, and the morale of the rebel army collapsed almost instantly. All that was left was to chase the ducks, with the rebels running in front and the Austrians chasing behind. But there is also something puzzling, that is, no one surrendered. This is not to blame. After all, the battlefield is so chaotic. If someone runs, everyone will run with them. Besides, the Austrian army does not have the habit of not killing people when they shout to surrender their guns. In fact, even if you shout, you may not be able to understand, and even if you do, you may not believe it. After all, Daniel Manin and the group of Jesuits under Pius IX have described the Austrians as apostles of the devil. A quick victory was completely within Franz's expectation. After all, if he couldn't win quickly and continued to spend so much time, supplies would be a problem. The lever action rifle's bullet consumption far exceeded Colonel Monta's expectations. Although other items such as rockets and grenades were easy to use, their consumption was also staggering. Even if each person rides with 2 cavalry, the ammunition load that is 10 times that of a traditional private soldier cannot withstand such consumption. Before the mid-19th century, a private soldier in Europe usually carried 60 to 80 rounds of ammunition. But there were slight differences between countries. The French soldiers usually carried the most ammunition, which usually carried 100 rounds of projectiles, while the Russian soldiers, who had the least, usually only had 10 to 15 rounds. The amount of ammunition prepared by the Austrian Empire varied greatly due to the different styles of each military region. However, according to the Austrian Drill Manual of 1821, a standard private soldier should carry 30 rounds of single-point bullets and 15 rounds of shotguns. That's right. Austrian soldiers carry shotguns because they do not require much training to hit the target. In fact, before the Austro-Prussian War, including the American Civil War, a soldier could usually fire 10 to 20 bullets in a large battle, which was pretty good. Even the 15 rounds of Russian ammunition are theoretically barely enough. The standard ammunition quantity in the Austrian Empire's drill manual is more than enough. But that was only for traditional troops. The shooting frequency and speed of Franz's troops were much higher than those of traditional troops, so he had the confidence to go straight to Huanglang. However, the corresponding consumption of bullets is also very alarming. Even a veteran can easily fire 100 rounds of bullets an hour in battle without firing randomly. It's no wonder that when Franz proposed that a new high-rate weapon could change the situation, officials in the War Department shook their heads. In fact, a high rate of fire means greater consumption, more supplies, and more money to spend. In fact, this problem had been exposed before in Galicia, but fortunately, the baggage troops were nearby, and the battle ended quickly without any major problems this time. The bullets carried by each soldier weighed 8 kilograms. If they were infantry instead of cavalry, the march would have been extremely tiring. Although the logistics support force of this army was all drafted by horses, the previous march was too fast and the draft horses dragging supplies were not war horses after all. As a result, the two sides are somewhat out of touch. Theoretically, the supply troops will arrive within an hour, but what if something happens again on the way? Franz didn't want to gamble, so the battle in Venice had to end as soon as possible, but someone still wanted to cause an accident. A burst of indiscriminate bombardment before the charge just happened to be close to Daniel Manon and Fabio, which directly caused the rebels' command system to collapse. In fact, even if they didn't collapse, they couldn't do much, but General Fabio didn't think so. He stopped the student soldier leader who was about to run away in advance. Why are you running? They have already come out of the turtle shell. Now is a good opportunity for us to counterattack. Stop them all. Drive those trash back. In close combat, we have an advantage in numbers. Giovanni, if you win this battle, you can do whatever you want. I promise you that. You will become the hero of Venice. No one dares to look down on you anymore. You can do anything and deal with anyone you want. You promise? I promise. The young man took a deep breath. Shot. The students around him were very surprised, and even the captain of the military governor under Fabio was a little stunned. But with a burst of hearty laughter, General Fabio said, "You are indeed a genius. I really have you. What are you still doing? Shoot. Kill these cowards who don't listen to orders." Only then did the student soldiers and the soldiers from the war team react. They had not fired before, because they were intimidated by the size and momentum of the deserters at this time. If the highest officer comes forward, and the most important thing is to have orders from others, they may feel better. Than gunfire rang out, and the crowd was finally stopped. Those who retreat will die. Rush back. Capture Franz and get whatever you want. When you break into Vienna, rush. After Giovanni finished speaking, other student soldiers and members of the supervising team also shouted. The decline was abruptly stopped. It has to be said that the Venetians have created a miracle at this time, but will this miracle really continue? Chapter 865 Hand-to-hand combat. When the two sides collided again, the rebel soldiers discovered some problems. The Austrian soldiers at the front were all very tall and carried guns without bayonets, and they also carried a large can behind them. This made the rebel soldiers feel a little confused. They're using water guns to spray us in the face. However, when the two sides approached a distance of 20 to 30 meters, the Austrian soldiers fired first, knocking down all the rebels' front row in an instant. But this was within Giovanni's expectation, and he immediately shouted, "Don't be stunned. Rush. Their bullets are out." At this time, Giovanni's student soldiers decided to take the lead, and General Fabio also ordered his reserves to rush forward. They knew very well that, as long as they could bring up morale, the outcome of the battle might be reversed. But they were wrong. The Austrian soldiers in front of them still had bullets in their guns. They were not carrying buckets, but airbags. This is the characteristic arm of the Austrian Empire. Air rifle soldiers. However, since the anti-French war, due to the high cost and lack of ideal results, they have gradually withdrawn from the army and have become the private armed forces of some princes and nobles. Therefore, it is normal for even the rebels who also serve in Austria have never seen this unit. But at this time, thanks to Franz's efforts, the air rifle soldiers were resurrected again. Only the sound of tar, tar, tar was heard, and those weird firearms fired bullets continuously. More than a dozen soldiers armed with high pressure air guns suppressed the rebels with fire, and the rebels couldn't even get close. Coupled with the dark Austrian soldiers behind them, the rebels at the front collapsed in less than a minute, dying and fleeing. This time neither Giovanni nor Fabio could stop the decline. Daniel Manin looked at the crowd who fled back again and roared, "For God's sake, do something quickly. What the hell can I do? Damn it. If you, the bastard, hadn't bewitched me, I would be the hero of Austria now." Fabio roared back and pushed Daniel Manin, the new honorary mayor, to the ground. "Damn traitor. Catch this traitor quickly. He is a lackey of the Austrians." Daniel Manin had tried this method on countless people before, but it failed at this time, because people were thinking about how to escape. Fabio spat hard in Daniel Manin's face. Just when the former was about to kill the latter, a group of cavalry and a large group of infantry, in mixed clothing, rushed over from behind them. The two-sided attack accelerated the collapse of the rebels, but the difference was that this time someone finally shouted, "Surrender and avoid death." In fact, the force that came to outflank was the reconnaissance force sent by Franz before. After breaking through the encirclement, they contacted the loyalist forces in Venice. In addition, Franz had contacted the remaining navy in the harbor area before, and a joint sea and land force was born. The rebels, who were attacked from both sides, almost sealed their defeat from the first moment, and then watched how they died. There was no suspense about the outcome of the battle. Most of the rebels chose to surrender. Those who did not surrender, or did not have time to surrender, were all killed on the spot. General Fabio and Giovanni appeared at the front of the team holding Daniel Manin, announcing the end of the battle. Franz accepted the other party's surrender, but the trouble was that Fabio and Giovanni insisted that they had captured Daniel Manin, and he was the hero of Austria. Archduke Franz, we have been waiting for the arrival of the Austrian Empire's heavenly soldiers for a long time. These damn gangsters have controlled our families and tempted us with high-ranking officials and generous salaries. We were forced, but it's fine now. You are here. The Imperial sun has risen again." Franz looked at the sky, which was already dark. Due to the damage caused by the war, many lighting systems in the city were damaged, making the whole city look extremely dim. "Invite them to the square of the city hall and starve them for a few days first, Archduke." Franz, the soldiers of the Royal Dragoons had seen this kind of thing too much in Galicia, so they were not surprised, and directly took several ringleaders for interrogation. According to past experience, these masterminds will have a list in their hands. They don't know why. These people don't run a company, so why do they have to have a roster and account books? The first thing Franz did when he occupied Venice was to restore communications with the outside world. One was to announce the good news. Since the war began, Austria had been on the defensive and needed a victory to boost morale. At the same time, it was also to frighten Ajaccio. The internal threat was the most troublesome. Another reason is that Venice's position was too important at this time. It was not only the core of northern Italy, but also the most critical maritime node of the Austrian Empire. Although Franz has been developing Trieste, people's thinking and government policies have inertia, and everyone will always unconsciously tilt towards Venice. People in their own country are like this, let alone other countries. Venice's glorious history gave it another chance to be reborn, but the war destroyed half of its vitality. But at this time Venice was still one of the most important ports in the Austrian Empire and even on the Mediterranean coast. At this time, the external channels were too important for the Austrian Empire. The reason why the Austrians were able to live a life with almost no worries about food and clothing during the disaster years was due to the blood sucking from the colonies. Once the supply to the colony is cut off, the domestic situation will quickly deteriorate, but it will not collapse. After all, France has accumulated a lot of inventory over the years. However, this will seriously slow down the subsequent economic development of the Austrian Empire and leave certain hidden dangers. The original purpose of this war was to solve the hidden dangers that had accumulated in the country for hundreds of years. France would never tolerate rape, just to end the war. In fact, in addition to this, France also reserved a hand, specially prepared for the British. The third point is to relieve Albrecht's worries. After all, the main supporters of the rebels who support the Papal States and Italy are in the cities, while the vast rural areas are more inclined to the royal family. It is easy for people in this era to look down on farmers, especially those high-ranking urban men. It is absolutely impossible for them to join forces with farmers. Poland was the best example before. At the same time, Marshal Radetzky led his main force to leave the battlefield in Milan, which made the rebels in Milan breathe a sigh of relief. They felt that their sacrifices were finally worthwhile. Carlo Alberto promised to arrive in Milan within 7 days, and at the same time, he would first give the rebels in Milan 5,000 rifles to survive the most difficult time point. But what they didn't know was that Eusebio, the veteran general of the Kingdom of Sardinia, was just preparing to cross the river. What they didn't even know was that Marshal Radetzky himself had arrived at the river with the vanguard and was watching all this quietly. Chapter 866 Battle of the Ticino River. The Ticino River originates in Switzerland. Its rapid flow is an important source of hydropower for later generations in Italy. It is also a paradise for rafting enthusiasts and anglers, but it was an ominous place at this time, and France and Austria had fought numerous wars here for hundreds of years. However, the Italians were not too impressed. After all, the last time they fought here was the Romans. Corsinius and Hannibal. The only bridge on the river was hundreds of years old, so Eusebio, a veteran of the Kingdom of Sardinia, built 2 temporary pontoon bridges. Although he was very optimistic about the prospects of this war, he was very anxious before and after. In front of them were the rebels in the city of Milan. Although Austria didn't do much, the mere sense of oppression made them unbearable. In fact, according to the rebel carrier pigeons, they had forced the Austrian army into the corner of the city, leaving only the city hall and city walls still in the hands of the Austrians. However, based on General Eusebio's experience, the Lombards were probably already surrounded. The so-called Austrian army can be driven out of Milan with just a little support, but it is probably because they have already run out of ammunition and food. Although he felt a little sorry for the Lombards, Eusebio felt that Radetzky's main force must be planning an encirclement and suppression at this time, and the latter must hope to end the battle before the former arrived. As the saying goes, to fight against foreign forces, you must first pacify yourself at home. Generals who have fought in wars all their lives understand this. So Eusebio can cross the river with peace of mind at this time, and then go to the city of Milan to harvest wheat. The pressure behind it did not come from King Carlo Alberto, but from some less noble people. As a traditional landed aristocrat, what I hate most are those capitalists who make a lot of money through evil ways, the aristocrats who betrayed the land, and those hateful liberals. Now there are many young people in Eusebio's army who are shouting for equality and freedom, and the king means to let them go first. Eusebio naturally understood what it meant. After all, those were his majesty's subjects, so it would be better to let the evil Austrians take the blame. The biggest problem he faced at this time was whether to let his assassin die first or let Ettore Snazzi, a young member of the Sardinian army, die first. However, considering that the Austrians might be defeated in one attack, General Eusebio decided to do it himself. After all, he could not give the credit to others. In a small forest not far away, the black muzzles were already in place. The ability to transport these cannons here did not depend on Marshal Radetzky's magic skills or some advanced towing equipment. In fact, Radetzky had been in Lombardy for so many years, and he knew the ambitions of the Sardinians clearly, plus Franz reminded him from time to time. So Radetzky made a lot of preparations. This was just one of his expected ambush locations. After all, he had 15 years to prepare very fully. Attacking halfway across the river can almost be regarded as a tradition of the Austrian army. This is not because Austria's generals are all water-loving, but because there are too many rivers in Austria's land, and the army is really overwhelmed. It is difficult to achieve any glorious victory without relying on geographical advantages, but it was different at this time, because Radetzky had been preparing for this for many years, and his opponent was the even more defeated Sardinian army. Father, the Piedmontese have begun to cross the river. Let's fire, kill them to pieces, and then deal with the traitors in the city. Colonel Anton von Radetzky spoke, a statement that made Marshal Radetzky shake his head. Do you know why you are still a colonel? Our family's title is low, Marshal. Radetzky was almost choked to death by his eldest son's upright speech, and he followed the lead. Is there no other reason? Think about it carefully, Colonel. Anton began to think seriously, and soon a flash of inspiration occurred to him. He thought of some of the plots he had seen in the novel, and after relating it to his own situation, he came to an astonishing conclusion. You training me? So that I can be put to great use. Before Colonel Anton could finish his words, Marshal Radetzky hit him hard on the head. You're not making progress? Aren't you too impetuous in doing things? You don't have the ability to adapt to circumstances. I'm here for you not to kill yourself and others. In short, your abilities are not worthy of a higher status. But there are so many useless generals in Vienna. They can all do it. I'm your biological son. That's enough. You idiot. Today I will show you how your father fights. The old marshal kicked his unsatisfactory son in the butt again, and then looked at the young man aside. In fact, he is said to be a young man, but Benedek has been in the army for more than 20 years. He is different from Colonel Anton. He was born as a civilian, and had to go through the test of almost death, even after graduating from the military academy. However, even after passing the hellish trial, his military rank was still just that of a colonel. However, Benedek has shown extraordinary talent, and has been appreciated by the old marshal. Now Marshal Radetzky must fulfill the obligations of an elder and win this battle. The old marshal waited for another half an hour, and the scouts from the Kingdom of Sardinia finally discovered the Austrian army. Several scouts rushed towards their own formation in a panic, screaming and shouting along the way, "The Austrians are coming. We are ambushed. Run!" At this time, the army of the Kingdom of Sardinia, that had just crossed the river, immediately exploded. Some people wanted to escape, and some wanted to charge. In the confusion, UCBO immediately ordered his officers to reorganize the team. As for whether to engage the enemy immediately or withdraw to the other side, he was still hesitating at this time. But it was less than half a minute. But Radetzky didn't want to give the other party a chance to think even for half a minute. The rumbling sound of artillery sounded, and rounds of solid bullets had already made bloody alleys at the front of the Sardinian army. Then there were rockets all over the sky. In fact, Marshal Radetzky was the first senior Austrian military official to support the research on Congreve rockets, but he never thought that this kind of thing would one day dominate the battlefield. However, the effect of dozens of rockets launched directly into the air was far stronger than the pressure of the god of war, and the Black Iron Bull was completely covered up by the gorgeous fireworks. The army of the Kingdom of Sardinia collapsed almost instantly. Tens of thousands of people became a mess. Crowds of people crowded together everywhere on the river and on the bridge. The war horses neighed and raised their front hooves high, but they still could not pass. In fact, even at this time, the equestrian psychic could not break out of the crowd. What UCBO thought of was to let the most elite Savoy cavalry in the Kingdom of Sardinia delay the enemy, so that he would have enough time to regroup. These elite cavalry from the Kingdom of Sardinia are worthy of their reputation as elites. They rushed onto the pontoon bridge and prepared to join the battle at the front without waiting for orders from their commanders, but their bravery was meaningless. The rioters, like frightened birds, directly blocked all roads. Chapter 867 Battle of the Ticino River. Moreover, before the first round of artillery fire ended, Marshal Radetzky ordered the entire army to press forward. He did not want to give the opponent a chance to regroup at all. The reason why you wait for the other party to discover you is not because of arrogance, but because you want to eliminate the other party's vitality as much as possible. At this time, the soldiers of the Sardinian army were crowded together like sheep, scrambling to escape to the other side of the river. Among them, those who were trampled to death and fell into the river cannot be counted. However, squeezing together is also troublesome for the Austrian cavalry, because it is impossible for them to charge into the crowd, even if it is a chaotic crowd. So the cavalry had to give up the credit to the infantry. However, the first batch came only with some hunters and skirmishers. Their main task was to harass, while the real large group of infantry was still marching quickly. This is not because Radetzky is pedantic and refuses to let the infantry charge. On the contrary, this reflects the well-trained and disciplined nature of his soldiers being able to maintain formation in the face of the enemy while advancing. This unit is undoubtedly an elite soldier in the traditional sense. Soon the two sides came into contact, and the surrounded Sardinian army was pushed away layer by layer, like cabbage. The gunfire was very neat, like a conductor's band, but it was composing a chapter of death. The army of the Kingdom of Sardinia did not last long, and the leading troops crossing the river chose to surrender. For the sake of safety, UCBO directly ordered the destruction of the bridge and the two newly built pontoons. This is the real reminder for the pawns who have crossed the river. Many of them were farmers, workers, craftsmen, and small businessmen before. They came here only after the king and the pope said that there was honor and wealth here. The result was endless marches and endless toil, guns and death. The faces of the surrendered Sardinian soldiers were full of confusion. What they wanted to know most at this time was, what are we doing here? But the corpses on the ground and the Austrian soldiers with guns brought them back to reality. They had no way of knowing their fate, so they could only put down their weapons and move forward one by one with their heads lowered. On the other side of the Ticino River, Eusebio was breathing heavily. He hadn't run so fast for a long time. He was almost crushed to death when he was on the bridge. It's a good thing the Austrians didn't cross the river, Eusebio breathed a sigh of relief, then looked at the remaining half of his army, and he smiled. It's simply perfect. He not only completed the task of harming the revolutionaries, but also preserved his own strength. Although he lost the battle, his status will definitely rise again after returning to China. But that was all based on the premise that the Austrian army could not cross the river. At this time, Eusebio felt that it was too wise to blow up the bridge. Judging from the confrontation just now, this should be the preset ambush circle for the main force of the Austrian Empire. Fortunately, he allowed those unstable factors to cross the river first, and thus saved his direct troops. I'm sorry, my lord. We did our best. A cavalry officer fell to the ground, feeling guilty for his complete ineffectiveness. Look at it, young man. We did not lose. We succeeded in blowing up the bridge and stopping the Austrians from advancing. We are the real heroes. The cavalry officer was confused. Sir, we just escaped from the other side of the river. Eusebio shook his finger. No, young man. This is the territory of our kingdom of Sardinia, not the other side. We guarded the country's gate and did not let the Austrians break in. This is our victory. Now our battle has just begun. Telling everyone to cheer up. Be careful of the Austrians crossing the river at night. On the east bank of the Ticino River, Colonel Lanton saw that fortifications were being built on the other side of the river and immediately reported to Marshal Radetzky. Sir, the Piedmontese are really busy on the other side. Aren't they going to attack Milan? The old marshal smiled. That old boy Eusebio is afraid that we will fight him. He is still so timid after decades. Then let's go back and clean up the mess in Milan. Colonel Anton honestly hated the Italians in Milan. He didn't have much prejudice against the Italian soldiers in the army, but the citizens of Milan gave him a very bad impression. Back then, Colonel Lanton was imprisoned by his father because he dealt with two Italians who were openly conspiring to rebel. He was almost angered to death. Fortunately, God opened his eyes and Vienna knew about this and dealt with the scum that deserved it. Historically, the colonel was angered to death. From his point of view, it was to safeguard the law and the dignity of the country. However, at that time, Austria adopted an appeasement policy towards the Italian region, which was to try not to offend the interests of the local people. This was not in line with Franz's values, so he slightly changed the history to save the colonel from an aggrieved death. Marshal Radetzky looked helpless at his stupid son. With such an obvious deployment of troops before, even a slightly experienced officer would not have said such stupid things. We're not going back. Let's go to Genoa. Huh. But this is more than 100 kilometers away from Genoa. Colonel Anton couldn't help but exclaimed. Marshal Radetzky said with a smile. I'm not afraid at this age. So what are you afraid of? But, father, is it still too late? There's enough time. Read more Sardinian newspapers. Their second legion just set off yesterday. It's possible that we arrived first. The old marshal was still very humorous, but he heard sweat pouring from Colonel Anton's forehead because they had marched from Milan before, and if they marched to Genoa again, the soldiers might not be able to bear it. However, Marshal Radetzky was very confident in his battle plan and even more confident in his soldiers. In addition, the accuracy of intelligence is also one of his sources of confidence. It would be difficult to conceal large-scale military mobilization. But this time Carlo Alberto simply stopped hiding in order to build momentum and sent the troops out of the city with great fanfare. Other areas also followed suit. Although this allowed the Kingdom of Sardinia and the liberals throughout Italy to see Collo Alberto's sincerity, it also exposed their root intelligence. For veterans like Radetzky, they can almost judge the opponent's marching speed from the distance between pigeon letters. 3 days later, the Sardinian army was defeated again by Genoa. However, Radetzky did not enter the city or even capture prisoners, but confiscated all their military supplies. News of the two defeats came back to Turin one after another, and Carlo Alberto was furious. This was no longer a failure, but a shame. Because they fought 2 battles. Until now, the Sardinian military does not know who is fighting them, how many there are, and where the opponent is. Both the North and the South said at the same time that they had encountered Radetzky's main force, and news came back from Milan that the Austrians were launching a general offensive against the rebels. Doesn't that Radetzky have 3 heads and 6 arms? On the other side, Franz of Venice shot more than 100 officers in one go. This news was once declared a rumor by Vienna officials. Chapter 868. How can poison be cured without scraping the bones? 3 days ago, Venice. The rebels had been making trouble in the city for so many days, and with the battle just now, the city of Venice finally stopped. The next day, Franz was almost shocked when he saw the post-war statistics. The city of Venice, which was originally garrisoned by only 20,000 people, actually had more than 10,000 people after a series of fierce battles. Needless to say, this was a Lois Parfis defeat. I didn't expect this group of people to run so fast. It seems that I have to deal with the remaining soldiers myself. But something ironic soon happened. It was not Franz who came to clean up the remaining soldiers, but General Alois Palfi, who had been missing for a long time. What's even more ironic is that the latter was very angry at this time, and the officers headed by him were furious. Damn. You bastards. You bastards. You guys who can only run away. Cowards. Do you think you can escape punishment by escaping here? Thousands of soldiers had to drag their exhausted bodies and stand under the scorching sun. Anyone who dared to move or look would be severely beaten with a whip. After several days of running around, these soldiers were exhausted. Coupled with the torture-like instructions and the whips falling from time to time, some people fell down in the queue from time to time. But those who fell would not receive sympathy, let alone treatment. They would only receive more severe beatings. As for those who dared to raise objections, they were directly hanged in the square. The charges were naturally treason and disobedience on the battlefield. Either one of them was enough to kill these big soldiers 10 times. General Alois Parfis' actions made Colonel Bordeaux and Colonel Monta very unhappy, and they also sympathized with the lower level soldiers. But Alois Parfi will become a general sooner or later. The Parfi family is a true aristocracy, with a history of nearly 1,000 years and even longer than the history of the Austrian Empire. Alois Palfi is the perfect candidate for the future head of the family. Killing these soldiers is not much more difficult for him than killing ants. Although Bordeaux and Monta were both from noble backgrounds, in comparison, they were like a pheasant and a phoenix. Although they despised them in their hearts, they could only look up to them. And even if they are willing to kill themselves, give up their aristocratic status, and even disregard their family safety and personal lives, to fight this privileged class to the end, the final result will mostly be nothing. Just like General Leakey before him, he could still secure such an important position as Commander-in-Chief of Venice City Defense. Even after suffering countless defeats, even Count Latter, who had always obeyed Franz, deliberately ignored this matter. Prince Metternich was also willing to use his family honor as a guarantee to ensure that General Leakey would not make a mistake. However, the result is obvious. Even though General Leakey received the advice of the 2 superior officials, he is still one of the biggest calendars in Venice. The reason why he dared to go his own way was because he knew that he would not be punished. Historically, after General Leakey lost Venice, instead of being sent to a military court, he was promoted to the Senate of the Senate. The same was true for Alois Palfi. He knew very well that he would not be punished, but in front of Franz, the future leader of the Palfi family did not want to lose face. Generally speaking, as the eldest son of 2 big families and the 2 future heads of the family, Franz and Alois will each take a step back. The former will pretend that he didn't see it, and the latter will restrain himself a little and put the blame on others superior. And then the Parfit family continued to be loyal to the Habsburgs. Hello, me. Everyone but Franz had been waiting for this day for more than 10 years, and before that he had to personally destroy the peaceful age he created at the risk of causing the Austrian Empire to regress or even disintegrate. Franz only had one sentence at this time: you deserve to die, Alois. Parfy was first a little confused, then a little surprised, and then he started to find it funny again at the words that the young boy Lengding said. Although the latter didn't say anything, the expression on his face was full of disdain and confidence. He had experienced too many things in his life, and no matter what he did wrong, he would always be safe in the end. As a result, Alois Palfy also came to an astonishing conclusion. He is God, and everything in the world except him is just his imagination. However, Franz was one of the few people who could bring him back to reality from his imagination, but Alois Palfy still stared at the former. He felt that the little kid in front of him was just being motivated. Sooner or later he will be like me. He will understand who is his. Alois Palfy thought so, but Franz repeated it again. You deserve to die. You deserve to hang here, Alois. Palfy said nothing, only sneered. But Franz's words frightened the others in the square. Alois's adjutant immediately stepped forward to stop Franz. Bordeaux subconsciously prepared to draw his gun, but Franz grabbed the adjutant's stretched out wrist, twisted, folded, and pressed it, and his hand was disabled. After the adjutant fell to the ground, he was shocked to realize that his arm had been broken. He immediately screamed, but what frightened him even more was that Franz took out a sack filled with nooses. Fighters of the Austrian Empire, I know that escaping is not what you want. The fact that you came all the way to Venice is proof of your loyalty. You are not to blame for the Venetian defeat, and you know who the culprit is. That is the highest military commander in the entire Venetian region. His escape from the battle forced you to flee. You are indeed guilty, but these officers are equally guilty. I just want to say one thing today: the officers and nobles should be more responsible for this defeat. Catch them all. Hang. Franz's words were orders. Although the soldiers and officers present were all uneasy, the soldiers of the Royal Dragoons did not care about this. They said that they were the personal soldiers left by the old emperor to Franz, and incidents again and again proved that Franz would be a capable and ambitious emperor. Soldier support heroes because they are more eager to achieve success than ordinary people. At this time, Alois Palfy behaved very rudely and even somewhat insulted his noble status. Do you know who I am? How dare you? At this time, Alois Palfy received an elbow on his armpit. Bordeaux had long been unhappy with this aloof duke. Of course they don't dare. I'm here to serve you, Alois. Palfy had never experienced such humiliation in his life, but he had never been beaten before. He was so painful that he could not speak. Seeing Bordeaux capture Alois Palfy and the wolf-like royal cavalry, the broken soldiers in the square became restless. In fact, they are the most unwilling people. They have become defeated soldiers and deserters without even fighting a battle. No one would be so willing. Chapter 869 Bloodline Awakening. Alois Palfy and his group of officers were soon arrested, and after a brief interrogation they were recruited. Most of this group of people are second-generation soldiers who have never been on the battlefield. As for why they want to escape, the answer is that they did not have a supply team at all, and it is unknown where the money that was supposed to be used for supplies went. The reason for returning to Venice was actually because they got news of Venice's recovery on the way, so they wanted to help Duke Alois Palfy regain his position. Naturally, it was impossible for them to admit defeat, so they could only blame the cowardice and incompetence of ordinary soldiers. They even prepared a set of excuses to silence Franz, but now there is no use for it. Franz wants to end this privilege of power and responsibility. Then more than 100 noble officers were hanged in the square of Venice without explanation. In fact, they had a lot to say, and many people they wanted to find, but Franz didn't want to hear or see them. Especially the noble Duke Alois Palfy. He wanted to know why Franz, when everyone can obviously live in peace. More than 100 corpses were hung neatly in a row on the square. Seeing the tragic deaths of the men who usually dominated them, the soldiers suddenly felt bad in their hearts and their spirits became slack. After all, Archduke Franz looked so young and didn't look like a bad person. But they soon changed that view. I ask you to immediately rush to the front line of the Po River to support Archduke Albrecht in his fight against the Papal State Army. As soon as these words came out, the soldiers immediately started talking. We've been running for several days, so we don't have the strength. Yes, and I heard that the Papal State has 1,000,000 troops. Aren't we going to die? No, no, Archduke. Franz, please have mercy on us. The noisy discussion soon turned into protests, but this was completely within Franz's expectation. After all, Franz was said to be a good man. There's no burden in saying no to a good person's request, and they don't have to worry about retaliation, so they decide to say no loudly. Bang, bang, Franz shouted after 2 gunshots. Quiet, this is not a request, but an order. I now order you to go to the Po River front line immediately. Those who resist will die. Franz's tone didn't seem to be fake, and more than 100 corpses were still watching in the square. The soldiers had no doubt that Franz dared to hang them. After all, he didn't even spare the officials, but this seems different from the good guys in the minds of the soldiers. Why are his methods so cruel? Why force us? Franz didn't care what these soldiers thought of him. He only knew that after the Battle of Venice, the entire Venetian region no longer needed so many troops. The next battle of the Po River and the battle in Lombardy were the key point. Franz executed more than 100 officers in Venice, and even executed the future head of the Parfi family. This incident caused an uproar in the city of Vienna, and various wealthy families began to take action. Regardless of whether this incident was true or false, they must seek an explanation from the Habsburg family and the Austrian Imperial government. While the aristocratic Senate was in a state of excitement, the old patriarch of the Parfi family kept a very low profile and did not make the matter public. He kept it secret even to his very close associates, and later even moved out of Vienna. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Mrs. Sophie looked at Count Zassel and asked, "That old man from the Palfi family claims that his grandson died for the country." "Yes. Old Duke Palfi had a falling out with the nobles of the Senate and wanted to leave Vienna, madam." Sophie sneered. "No wonder he lived so long. Forget it. The Palfi family will not be held responsible for this matter. Those who cause trouble will all be arrested and interrogated strictly. Most of them are accomplices of Pius IX. Count Zassel was in some trouble." "You mean the leader? Or all of them?" "Arrest them all. Don't you understand? The secret police don't have enough manpower. You can go to the Bavarian Association to ask someone to help you." Mrs. Sophie was a little impatient. Count Zassel had followed the former for so many years and naturally knew that Mrs. Sophie found it difficult, so he was very irritable. However, catching hundreds of respectable nobles at once is a very difficult task, and if you are not careful, you may even lose your life. Count Zassel would not trust the so-called secret police to do this kind of thing, because most of them are locals, and many are even spies sent by big families. Let's not talk about whether they will cooperate inside and outside. Just leaking some news will cause an uproar. So Earl Zassel decided to find people from the Bavarian Association and left some difficult tasks to the orphans who were adopted more than 10 years ago. But he still wanted to ask under what name those people should be arrested. Grand Princess, it's a bit too much to say that they are accomplices of Pius IX. Maybe they were bewitched, madam. Sophie waved her hand. "I'll do as you say, but there's no need to be merciful. Franz is right. These ripoffs will do nothing but hinder us at critical moments." Earl Zassel spread his hands. After all, he was once a member of a great noble family, but the eldest son of a great noble family fell in love with a woman he shouldn't love. "I didn't tell you." "Thanks." Zassel turned and left to do the most difficult thing at the moment. When he reached the door, Mrs. Sophie spoke. "Thank you for all these years, Earl." Zassel turned around and bowed respectfully, then turned and went out. At this time, the Papal States army was still trudging across the mountains and ridges in central Italy. None of the Italian countries had experience in organizing large armies to go on expeditions. In addition, some high-level officials of some countries deliberately withheld money, and the Italian coalition forces were in a very difficult situation. Archbishop Cavaghi, a 93-year-old veteran who once served in Frederick the Great's army, finally completed the final journey of his life. A week before the Battle of the Po, Archbishop Cavaghi died of old age. Turin Royal Palace. Carlo Alberto looked at the two disgraced generals. He was speechless. What was even more speechless was that the two lieutenant generals Eusebio and Ettore di Sanas actually boasted at the same time that they had transformed the liberal revolution. The party has done a terrible job in this matter. That's not the point at all. Okay, where's my Lombardy, Carlo? Alberto struggled and roared, but he couldn't show it. After all, he still had to rely on these two losers. If the Austrian army really breaks into the Kingdom of Sardinia, then he will really be at a loss. You must know that this time he took the initiative, while the Austrians defended passively. How can we not lose? At this moment, Carlo Alberto suddenly had a flash of inspiration, and an inspiration flashed rapidly in his mind. At this moment, his Italian blood was completely awakened. On March 21, 1848, the Kingdom of Sardinia announced its support for Austria against the Italian coalition, and at the same time, arrested remnants of the Carbonari in the Piedmont region. I went off topic halfway through writing, and started writing it again, so I posted it very late. Sorry. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 870 12 articles. Since Pius IX revived the concept of Italy, the good days of the liberals in the Kingdom of Sardinia began. The subsequent Sicilian uprising gave it a free ride, and the Holy War of the Papal States and the Kingdom of Sardinia's decision to send troops pushed it to the top. These Carbonari remnants began to imagine that perhaps Carlo Alberto and Pius IX would accept their constitution. Carlo Alberto did appoint a number of liberal officials and even pardoned Carbonari members who had opposed him. The king's series of wise actions convinced them that that day seemed not far away. The liberals in the domestic bourgeoisie also began to reciprocate. They began to praise Carlo Alberto's virtuous name in newspapers and in public. But the king always had only one thing on his mind, and that was how to get rid of these troublesome guys in the country. Although Carlo Alberto strictly ordered that the story of the defeat should not be reported, what was helpless was that before the expedition, Eusebio and Ettore di Sanas found the newspaper office almost coincidentally. In addition to professional reporters from newspapers, there were also a large number of so-called civilian tabloid reporters accompanying the army. These people were all released by Marshal Radetzky as non-combatants. As a result, rumors spread everywhere, true and false news flying all over the sky. In addition, Austrian intelligence agents interfered with it, and the people even got the news before the official. At this time, Carlo Alberto's reputation was in disgrace. He simply claimed that he was bewitched by liberals and Jesuit priests. The Kingdom of Sardinia was always a friend of the Austrian Empire, and then began to arrest domestic liberals with great fanfare. For a time, the entire Piedmont region was full of bloodshed, especially universities, newspapers, and factories, which became the focus of the king's army. The situation took a turn for the worse, even making those naive people wonder whether the king was really possessed by evil spirits. I don't know if the king is possessed by evil spirits, but some constitutionalists and liberals never believed that the king would arrest them until their death. They wanted to scare off the army with just one response as before, but they suddenly found that the support was gone. Most of their supporters were sent to the battlefield, and most of them were captured. Even if they escaped by chance, those people would not be able to return for a while. Therefore, Carlo Alberto's bloody actions did not encounter much resistance, but the messenger from the Kingdom of Sardinia was directly arrested by Radetzky as a spy. To be honest, this was the first time in his life that the 82-year-old marshal had encountered such a shameless person. However, Alberto's actions were known to everyone, so Radetzky decided not to be ashamed. Anyway, it is normal for the elderly to have trouble seeing and hearing. However, the old marshal still underestimated Carlo Alberto. His cousin was the Empress of the Austrian Empire, so he could skip Radetzky, the war marshal, if he wanted to send a message to Vienna. Vienna, Hofburg Palace. Count Raikkonen, Baron Kiel, Archduke Franz Karl, and Grand Duke Louis all looked at each other in confusion. With their political wisdom, it was difficult to figure out what Carlo Alberto was doing. Count Raikkonen and Baron Kiel were already marginalized figures. They used to do whatever others said. As for Archduke Franz Karol and Grand Duke Louis, these two were even more heavyweights. The four of them looked at each other together for a long time, but couldn't come up with a solution. To be honest, none of them have a good impression of the Kingdom of Sardinia, which has repeatedly jumped. But if the other party surrenders, it should be more beneficial to the Austrian side. After all, there is one less enemy. But it was emotionally unacceptable, and at this moment Mrs. Sophie broke in. Generally speaking, women are not allowed in this kind of place where military and political matters are discussed, but the kind of people who can take charge of the overall situation are no longer there, so naturally Mrs. Sophie has nothing to worry about. In fact, at this time, everyone in the Regency Council really hopes to have a backbone. Even the most staid Grand Duke Louis showed a very happy expression, but he still had to act like an elder. Grand Duchess Sophie, you shouldn't be here. Then, shall I leave? Grand Duke Louis turned his face to look at his nephew. Take care of your wife. What a shame, Archduke. Franz Karol ignored Archduke Louis, but stood up and moved his chair next to Madame Sophie. This move made Grand Duke Louis speechless for a moment, and the two ministers of the Regent Council were also frightened. After all, Madame Sophie had a bad reputation, and she easily drowned people in the Danube River and hung up street lamps. Of course, these are just rumors, but recently many nobles have been kidnapped by Bavarian gangs. The domestic secret police have been investigating for several days, but have not found anything, and these problems are all pointed at Mrs. Sophie. You four grown men have been discussing for a whole day and still haven't come up with any results. Not yet, Princess. This matter is very difficult. I don't think there is any need to discuss this matter. If the Kingdom of Sardinia wants to start a war with us, it can start a war. If it wants to stop the war, it can push a few liberals to die. How could such a good thing happen in this world? Count Raikkonen and Baron Kiel looked at each other, and it seemed that they were going to fight to the end, but that didn't matter. After all, Marshal Radetzky had fought deep into the heart of the Kingdom of Sardinia and won a great victory. I believe it would only be a matter of time before he surrendered. The problem. Count Raikkonen finally asked, what do you mean? You don't accept King Alberto's explanation. Why don't you accept it? Carlo Alberto's cousin is our queen. The Habsburg family has always been known for its kindness, so we can't be too ruthless. That the Papal States Army is still watching. Milan and Venetia are still in danger. And then, this is what the Hungarians sent. Madam Sophie placed a document on the table. What's this, Count Raikkonen and Baron Kiel asked in unison, because the confidential document had been opened. In theory, this top-level secret document can only be viewed by the Regent Council and the Minister of War. Mrs. Sophie's behavior was obviously overstepping her bounds. Let's see. The Hungarians proposed a 12-point peace agreement. If we don't agree, they will go to war. Count Raikkonen quickly pulled out the document and read out. 1. The Austrian Empire must completely cease its right to censor and supervise all publications in Hungary. 2. Move the capital to Budapest. 3. Replace the original Great Parliament of Pressburg with the small Parliament of Pest. 4. Religious freedom, legal equality, and the Hungarian Parliament have the final right to interpret the laws of the St. Stephen's Crown territory. 5. Reorganize the army. Austrian officers must withdraw from the Hungarian army. All armies in the Crown territory of St. Stephen are controlled by the Hungarian Parliament. 6. Abolish the labor service system. No one has the right to let Hungarians work for free. Hungary no longer had any feudal obligations to Austria. Chapter 871 12 Articles. 7. The tax power of the Crown territory of St. Stephen belongs to the Hungarian Parliament, and it can independently formulate tax types and adjust tax rates according to its own situation. Everyone must pay taxes, including the estates of Austrian nobles and royal territories. 8. The judiciary is independent, and the Hungarian Parliament has the power to formulate all laws within the territory of the Crown of St. Stephen. 9. Hungary requires the establishment of an independent national bank with the right to issue currency. Austria must recognize its value and must not denigrate or reject Hungarian currency. 10. Soldiers in Hungary must re-swear allegiance to the Hungarian constitution. Austria has no right to mobilize Hungarian soldiers. All Hungarian troops in Italy must withdraw to Hungary. At the same time, soldiers in Hungary must withdraw unless they are loyal to Hungary. 11. The Austrian side must immediately release the Hungarian prisoners in custody. 12. The territory originally belonging to the Crown of St. Stephen will be renamed Hungary from now on, and will be under the unified jurisdiction of the Hungarian government. Transylvania and Vojvodina will be merged into Hungary. Count Raikkonen's hands began to shake when he was halfway through reading. If the Austrian Imperial government really accepted such a peace agreement, then Austria would really become a colony of Hungary. In addition to losing control of nearly 1/3 of its territory, Austria must also surrender Transylvania and Vojvodina. My lord, how do you feel? It's so deceptive. Those damn guys. At this time, he actually proposed such a crazy agreement. He is simply taking advantage of the situation. It's just taking advantage of the situation. Mrs. Sophie made no secret of it. After all, many Hungarian nobles had joined Franz's plan at this time. In order to preserve their shares in the Hungarian Development Company, it was impossible for these to mix with the revolutionaries in Budapest. In fact, there is even more shocking news. That is, the Hungarian side has sent troops to Pressburg. But she didn't want to continue to exert pressure at this time, because these people might not be able to bear it. Compared with the Italian coalition forces of the Hungarians and the Papal States, the King of Sardinia was really nothing to mention. The Kingdom of Sardinia is really cheap this time, said the two regents, but Madame Sophie corrected them. It's not about taking advantage of them. We can settle the accounts later. Austria declares a truce with the Kingdom of Sardinia. Yes, it's a truce, not an armistice in the usual sense. This is worth pondering, but both sides need a breathing space, so the Kingdom of Sardinia and Austria stopped the ongoing war. As for the captives of the Kingdom of Sardinia, they naturally followed the old rules common in Europe, ransoming people with money. The ransom culture in Europe has a long history, and can even be traced back to the wars between the Romans and the Gauls. As for the amount of ransom, there are corresponding standards for the treatment of prisoners. For example, there was once a British soldier who was captured 24 times in his life, and the total ransom paid was 400 large Spanish silver coins. This was equivalent to the total income of the halberdier during his service life. Finally, under his strong request, the British royal family had to come up with a sum of money to compensate for his losses, and a certain knight who participated in the Crusades paid 260,000 gold coins in order to redeem himself. This is of course positively related to the person's status and the degree of damage caused. At the same time, factors such as local prices at the time must also be taken into consideration. The price offered by the Austrian side was 600 florins for each Sardinian prisoner. As for the officers, the price naturally increased. However, some related people can still be released early through the back door, but the specific price is unknown. For ordinary people, the price of 600 florins is unimaginable, and the Austrian official naturally does not expect the other party to make a private redemption. To be honest, people who are officials in Austria are not stupid. Who has the money to be a top soldier? This is obviously a blow to the Kingdom of Sardinia. In theory, if the Kingdom of Sardinia is defeated, it should cede territory and seek peace. But now Austria cannot protect itself, so it can only take a step back and only wants money, not land. Regarding the 600 florins required for an ordinary prisoner, Austria has strict statistics and can provide reasonable sources of expenditure. First of all, there will inevitably be casualties in wars. The dead need to be buried, and the injured need treatment. Medical expenses in Europe were always sky high before World War II. Doctors and lawyers have long been the highest paid groups in Europe. Ordinary doctors are naturally unable to treat stab wounds and gunshot wounds on the battlefield, so professional doctors must be hired. It's no joke that a hairdresser moonlights as a doctor. Naturally, full-time doctors are much more expensive than those who are wild and unlicensed. Secondly, prisoners of war are human beings too. They have to eat and drink, right? You must know that this is a disaster, and the food supply in Europe is soaring, so it is reasonable to charge a high ransom, right? At the same time, with such a large group of people gathering together, in order to prevent the occurrence of the plague, some precautions must be taken, right? It makes sense to ask a few priests to spray disinfectant, right? The ransom has increased over time. In addition, those armies from the Kingdom of Sardinia did not come to Austria to repair bridges and roads. The buildings they destroyed and the flowers and plants they trampled to death are also money, right? And to capture such a large group of people, they need a place to stay, right? So it makes sense to build a prisoner of war camp, right? You ask where Austria got the manpower to build prisoner of war camps during the war. Naturally, professional matters must be left to professional people, so that the captives can have enough food and clothing by themselves. Helping build a prisoner of war camp can also reduce some ransoms, so Sardinian prisoners of war are very motivated. Some people even planned not to go back after hearing the Austrian army's offer. They think it would be a good idea to simply work as construction workers here. After all, food and housing are taken care of here, and the wages are not low. In fact, the wages of workers in the Austrian Empire at this time were much higher than those in other countries, which is one of the reasons why workers in Austria rarely made trouble. Marshal Radetzky didn't mind too much about these Italian prisoners of war living in Lombardy. After all, these people seemed to be more able to endure hardships and be more diligent than the locals. Moreover, the old marshal is a person who pays great attention to publicity. Compared with those pure soldiers, he has more political skills. This gave the Austrian army a good image, at least in the eyes of ordinary people. Not as bad as the Jesuit propaganda. At this time, these prisoners of war who were working hard in the Austrian prisoner of war camp were undoubtedly the best propaganda machines. After returning to the Kingdom of Sardinia. However, Marshal Radetzky regretted not capturing more prisoners of war. In fact, in order to speed up the march, the prisoners of war in the Kingdom of Sardinia had always been in custody. If those people really wanted to escape, they had many opportunities. However, the reality is that almost no prisoners of war chose to escape. Most of them chose to be obedient and wait for the Austrian army to come back to accept them. There were 37,000 prisoners, and the ransom amounted to 23 million florins. Carlo Alberto felt that the Austrians were crazy, and it was impossible for him to pay to ransom the prisoners. Chapter 872. Adding insult to injury. However, at present, it is impossible for the Kingdom of Sardinia to continue to offend the Austrians, but Carlo Alberto does not want to think about this unjust money. The Kingdom of Sardinia simply resorted to the procrastination trick again. Yes, they will redeem people, but they need to raise money, so the time is uncertain. Although it is a bit rogue, it is very reasonable. After all, more than 20 million florins is not a small number. A large amount of money had been spent to buy Swiss Carlo Alberto, and coupled with the recent publicity and expedition, the treasury of the Kingdom of Sardinia has reached its bottom. No king or government in the world likes to be in debt. Most of them are in debt out of necessity. At this time, Carlo Alberto naturally delayed as long as he could. The Austrian side has no good solution to this problem. It can only send people to negotiate and ask the other party to pay as soon as possible. But that was only in the normal sense, and Franz was not panicked at all. After all, raising tens of thousands of mouths was not a problem for the Austrian Empire. Especially after the sea passage to Venice is restored. A large amount of food from the Americas will greatly alleviate the crisis in northern Italy. However, the Austrian side will not completely follow Austrian standards when calculating the captives' food. After all, this is a domestic supply price. How can the Kingdom of Sardinia enjoy it? To put it simply, food prices are very expensive in disaster years. If Carlo Alberto does not redeem people early, the late payment fees incurred will be enough to cost him a pot. This finally caused some heartache for Sardinia, but it was only a symbolic redemption of a group of officers, and the pull between the two sides continued. After the city of Venice was recovered, most of the rebellions in the Venetian region were immediately eliminated, and the reorganized troops swept away most of the rebellious cities along the way. In fact, the cities that had been occupied by the rebels welcomed the return of the Austrian troops, and the so-called Italian nationalist enthusiasm did not seem to affect them at all. In a sense, this is due to Neil Manin, First of all, in order to ensure the capture of Venice, he used almost all the strength and backbone of the entire Venetian rebels, and almost all of these people were wiped out in the Battle of Venice City. They died and escaped. The rebels without a leader were naturally vulnerable. If Neilmanin did not gather the rebels in one place, but spread them throughout Venetia as before, then Franz would be really difficult to handle. Even with all the elites in Austria, it would not be easy to pull out such an ale. Franz was already prepared for this. Over the years, he had cultivated many confidants in northern Italy. These people had each established an organization to cooperate with the Austrian army in the campaign. Now Neilmanin's self-confidence helped Franz to get rid of the sting behind his back. Franz was not in a hurry to execute Fabio and Neilmanin. They did commit heinous crimes, but with them, the rebels in Venice had a target. If they are all dead, it will be troublesome for the rebels to cause trouble everywhere. Franz gave the rebels 2 weeks, enough time for another attack. At the same time, the Austrian army can also complete its deployment along the Po River, which is the most critical to the war situation at this time. But Franz actually thought too much, because when the news of Fabio and Neilmanin's defeat in Venice City came out, most of the illegal organizations disbanded directly, and some even chose to betray directly. Repeated horizontal jumping is actually not just a stunt of Carlo Alberto. Ordinary Italians also inherit this blood ability. The rebels and nationalists in the Venetian region suddenly became street rats that everyone shouted to beat. Compared with uncovering secrets and reporting in cities, it is much more straightforward in the vast rural areas. Farmers and pro-Austrian squires treat them as wild boars and kill them in exchange for money. Austrian officials are also happy to use this reward and punishment mechanism to further divide the rebels in Venetia. Garibaldi, who had previously commanded the attack on Verona, was offered a sky-high price of 500,000 florins for his head. Most people thought Franz was making a fuss out of a molehill, but he felt that even 1 million florins, not to mention $500,000, was worth the price of admission. Others don't understand, because they don't know what a great feat this man wearing a red scarf has accomplished in history. 1,000 versus 100,000, the ultimate battle, the hero of two worlds, the great father of modern guerrilla warfare, the only designated god of war in modern Italy. Even if you don't know the history of later generations, the battle in Venice alone is enough to prove his worth. With only a few thousand militiamen, they captured 3 cities in a row and treated the Austrian supreme commander in Venetia, Alois Parfi, and his 50,000 troops like monkeys. If it weren't for the huge gap in strength between the two sides and bad luck, Garibaldi might have captured Verona. This was not something anyone could do. You must know that Verona is a fortified city. Although Alois Palfi's resume has element of god making and his temperament is very weird, he is by no means completely incompetent. However, with the arrival of the armies of Franz and Albrecht, Venice was on the verge of collapse. This was not something that Garibaldi could save alone. Franz's victory in Venice was undoubtedly a shot in the arm for the central government of the Austrian Empire. After the war started, those nationalists and constitutionalists disappeared. After all, if they continued to make trouble, the Austrian government could use their tricks to send them to the battlefield. However, after the situation stabilized, they were the first people the Vienna government had to deal with. This group of people used to drive up prices, and even officials could not guarantee 3 meals a day and did not dare to add more salt in cooking. The gangsters dared to ride on top of the secret police and gendarmes. Now that the situation has reversed, it's no wonder they have taken back their capital and profits. The group of capitalists who had previously encouraged Solomon Rothschild to become the spokesman for the constitutionalists approached Solomon again. Solomon was not polite this time. He directly asked the military police to arrest him. After all, the Rothschild family is not a rioter, and taking this opportunity, the family's business has finally developed significantly. In fact, Solomon's business in Vienna has not been doing well since the food crisis. The Austrian Empire's economy has developed rapidly over the years, but he missed several key opportunities, especially the coal and iron mining industry in Bohemia directly allowed a second-rate bank to take off and become an existence on par with him. So generally speaking, Solomon's status in Austria is constantly declining. This time Metternich stepped down. As a Jew, he was also affected. The reason is of course that he collaborated with Metternich and betrayed his country. The conscience of heaven and earth is that the Jews obviously have no motherland. However, this time the Vienna government's counterattack finally satisfied him, and Vienna's financial circle was almost wiped out. Those former competitors were either directly imprisoned or forced to accept heavy fines. Some with stronger connections and more sophisticated skills had to provide the Austrian government with a long-term low-interest or even interest-free loan. In fact, this time the Vienna government was much more determined and powerful than before, but it didn't seem obvious to the high-level circles where Solomon hung out. But the constitutionalists and liberals at the bottom have suffered a devastating blow, but the life and death of these people is not within the scope of consideration at the top. The reason why Franz had to deal with these little evils was not because he bullied the weak and feared the strong, but because he knew that the people at the bottom were the main force of the rebellion. Those at the top understand the rules of social operation better than those at the bottom and are deeply involved in the network of interests. In fact, they will be more at ease. As for those at the bottom, who have poor risk resistance, they are the group of people who most hope to change the world. Franz was not against change, he just didn't want it to become a mere shuffling of cards. Solomon stood in the right position during this crisis. Not only did he make a lot of money, he even received an honorary citizen medal from the Vienna government. At that time, Jews were still not regarded as nationals by most people, so the honorary citizen medal was the highest honor they could receive, except for those who joined the army. But Solomon soon got into trouble and even locked himself in his room. Everything stemmed from a piece of news that the Hungarians were preparing to rebel, and their troops were secretly advancing towards Pressburg. Pressburg was the capital of Hungary at this time, and Budapest was not even one city, but two, connected by the Széchenyi Bridge. Pressburg is not only the nominal capital of Hungary, but also a symbol of Austrian imperial power at this time. The Hungarians were undoubtedly playing for real. Although Austria had successively won great victories in Venice and Lombardy, the threat from the Italian coalition had not dissipated. At this time, the Hungarian cavalry rebelled, which was undoubtedly the worst case scenario for Austria. In fact, as a member of the famous Rothschild family in the 19th century, he had a wide range of intelligence sources. The nephew in London also gave Solomon accurate news. The British would participate in the war, but the target was not Austria itself, but the overseas colonies of Austria, just like during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of the Spanish Throne. Put these two pieces of news together, and Solomon had to reconsider the problem. Now is it time to add insult to injury, or to provide help in times of need? The conditions offered by the Hungarians are very attractive. The honorary president of the Hungarian National Bank, Rothschild Bank, will obtain the right to issue currency and give him Hungarian national status. On the other hand, it provides a large war loan to the Austrian Empire. On the one hand, it can gain national recognition and there will be no shortage of honorary titles and titles at the same time. He would be better off in Vienna as a creditor, just as his brother Mir had been during the Napoleonic Wars. But at this time another news came, that the Czechs in Bohemia had revolted. Lars, bring me Mr. Alexander Bach and Mr. Gushenkas. The housekeeper was a little puzzled. Sir, wouldn't it be bad to get involved with those constitutionalists at this time? What? Do you know? Today is going to change again, Solomon said with emotion. How could the housekeeper not understand? And immediately agreed, and took his most capable assistant out to do the work. To be honest, Lars didn't think highly of Alexander Bach and Gushenkas, because these two people escaped too quickly. After they got the news, they fled without caring about the lives of those who followed them. But in Lars's eyes, those so-called followers deserved to die. But now that Mr. Solomon actually wants to associate with such a person, and it is such a sensitive moment, the streets are full of secret police and military police, he really feels a little uneasy. The happiest people at this time were the British. Although uprisings began in some parts of Ireland, the Scots were also making trouble, and the constitutionalists in London marched all day long. But the French provisional government played itself to death. They first went to war with Austria, and were slapped in the face by the speed of light. Then they tried to suck blood from the colonies to solve the domestic crisis, but were rejected by each colony. The successive uprisings in the country have caused France's national strength to regress, and Palmerston has begun to establish a pro-British government. Naturally, John Russell could not remain idle. He was preparing to attack the French colonies. Although the French had a large number of troops in North Africa, supplies still relied on domestic and plundering indigenous peoples. Therefore, as long as the British fleet conducts a naval blockade, it will not be long before the French army in North Africa surrenders. But there was not so good news at this time. That is, the Austrians defeated the rebels in the Kingdom of Sardinia and Venetia at the speed of light. Moreover, there was no peace treaty between Austria and the Kingdom of Sardinia, but a truce. This is worth pondering. The Austrians most likely want to take action against the Kingdom of Sardinia. After solving the Italian coalition point, it will be difficult for Britain to intervene by then. If Austria is allowed to gain Genoa, then Britain's strategy of blocking the Adriatic Sea will fail. Moreover, after acquiring Genoa, Austria's economy will develop faster, and their products will begin to compete with Britain around the world. In fact, this competition has already begun, with Austrian products appearing in the German Confederation, France, the United States, and even South America and India. John Russell himself also bought some. These things are indeed advanced and easy to use. The design of each piece seems to have been polished for hundreds of years, so that even the pickiest person can't see any faults. But this is not what the British want to see, and he must stamp out this tendency. After the expansion of the British Mediterranean fleet, it can completely suppress the French Great Eastern Fleet, and the excess ships can completely block the Adriatic Sea. The advantage of this is to ensure that the Austrians will not directly use the sea advantage to land directly in Rome and Naples. After all, the navy of the Italian coalition is just a bunch of large armed merchant ships. They may not even be able to deal with pirates, so how can they compare with the Austrian navy? And, based on the experience of the British, the Austrian Empire at this time liked to take risks with its troops. If they could not protect them, Archduke Franz would lead a beach landing. Secondly, John Russell did not believe in the level of the Italian coalition. After all, the Kingdom of Sardinia claimed to have an army of 200,000, but it failed to hold out for a week before it rebelled. In fact, whether Austria wants to annex the Kingdom of Sardinia or the Kingdom of Sardinia falls to Austria, the situation on the European continent will become uncontrollable for Britain. Their purpose is that no one family can dominate Europe. Whether it is France, Russia, or Austria. You always need a reason to join the war, but Pius IX had already thought of it for the British. Moreover, Britain has never been afraid of anyone in naval battles. This kind of risk-free business was John Russell's favorite. It's too late to go home, so I'll make do with it for now, and I'll change it later. Chapter 873 April Fool's Day, London, Whitehall. The members of Congress did not have much objection to going to war with Austria, but they were a little worried. That is it really wise to go to war with two powerful countries, Austria and France, at the same time? Your Majesty Prime Minister, we know that you have already deployed a fleet in the Mediterranean, but now we have not yet achieved a decisive victory in the battle with the French. Does it seem too hasty to intervene in the Italian issue and fight against Austria at this time? John Russell shook his head. Mr. Congressman, we have to look forward. The only countries in the world that can compete with us for colonies are France and Austria. And I don't know if you have ever used Austrian products. Strong, durable, and cheap. If it weren't for their weak naval strength and their own narrow attributes, they would have completely surpassed France and become our biggest competitor. There is still no company in our country that has made a replica of an Austrian sewing machine, which is undoubtedly a huge shame. But rather than honor, I think it is more important to extinguish this fire that threatens us in advance. The audience immediately burst into warm applause. After all, what Britain has done for hundreds of years is to protect its own trade and crack down on competitors. The plutocrats behind the congressman like to hear this most. In fact, it was natural that John Russell was not the only one who used Austrian products. Most members of Congress had used them. After all, he was not the only rich person. In particular, the richer people are, the more they like to consume high-end foreign luxury goods, because in this way they can be unique. The British bourgeoisie in the 19th century no longer catered to the tastes of kings and nobles like their counterparts on the European continent. They wanted their own independent art and aesthetics. However, John Russell's idea was a bit naive. Whether luxury goods are useful is actually secondary. Its main function is a tool for the upper class to compete and differentiate among themselves. Moreover, sewing machines are actually labor tools, not luxury goods. However, the crazy purchasing desire of some nobles and businessmen led the Mastre. Franz's factories also followed suit, deliberately distinguishing sewing machines for industrial production from household sewing machines. Then, in order to further divert customers, they also came up with a bunch of concepts, such as steel sewing machines and mahogany sewing machines. Franz estimated that this was the earliest prototype of consumerism, and this concept was strongly welcomed by the British. However, sewing machines and rubber shoes have become luxury goods, which is still a bit magical in Franz's eyes. In fact, Austrian sewing machines and rubber shoes were the best-selling contraband goods in Britain at this time, and the skills of sewing machines and vulcanized rubber were not difficult. However, they started many years later than Austria, and coupled with the lack of some key technologies and processes, the products they produced were completely unable to compete with Austria. If trade barriers had not been restored, London might now be filled with Austrian goods. There was no strong opposition in the entire British Parliament. After all, Britain was experiencing the throes of economic crisis and domestic rebellion at this time, and they were eager to launch a war. Although the British did not recognize France's provisional republican government, they had no idea of restoring the country to Louis Philippe, and they did not have any good impressions of Count Chambord. The British's purpose is very simple, that is, to keep Europe in chaos. It would be great if Palmerston could really support a pro-British France on the European continent, but this is not important. Afterwards, Lord Auckland, Lord Admiralty, announced his great battle plan in Parliament, a plan that could make him invincible. At this time, the British Parliament was full of confidence. They felt that their sudden attack would surely catch the Austrians by surprise. But what they didn't expect was that Solomon Rothschild had already received the news that Britain would declare war on Austria and would send a Mediterranean squadron to block the Adriatic Sea. What they didn't even expect was that one day after they declared war, the British Mediterranean fleet would be completely wiped out. Port of Durrës, Albania. Sentinel Jack tried hard to hide his body in the watchtower, where the death and disappearance rates of sentinels were horrifyingly high. The savage locals will do everything they can to assassinate the invaders, including kidnapping, poisoning, and blackmail. But the most terrifying thing is not them, but some bounty hunters, who can shoot sentries from extremely far away. According to the above estimation, it is most likely that he is a skilled old hunter in the mountains, and he probably uses the kind of homemade super long gun. The so-called super long gun refers to a rifle with a barrel length exceeding 1.2 meters. At that time, the barrel length of most military rifles was about 1 meter. However, some hunters and hunting enthusiasts usually lengthen the barrel to 1.2 meters or even longer, which will help improve the accuracy of the bullet. In fact, according to British military history, when Afghans fought against British troops, they usually used 1.5 meter super long guns to snipe British troops from a long distance. For these skilled hunters, the Albanian garrison also thought of many ways, sending troops into the mountains to sweep them, and sending cavalry to pursue them. But the results were very poor. When the army entered the mountains, it was like sinking into the sea. At most, more than 300 people were sent at one time, but no one came back alive. Later, the British army in Albania called those mountains the mouth of the devil. In fact, for the British army, which only had a total of 3,000 people, it was a joke to go into the mountains to search for enemies. As for the cavalry, they also have no advantage in such complex terrain. Moreover, their cavalry is limited in scale and seriously insufficient in number, so they are still giving away their lives afterwards. The commander of the Albanian garrison specially hired navy sharpshooters to counterattack. However, the effect is still very unsatisfactory. After all, the opponent is not interested in fighting, and the purpose is just to harass and destroy. There is absolutely no reason in this world to prevent thieves the day before, and the British soon discovered that this method did not work. So they spread their marksmen farther away, resulting in a large number of deaths of these elite marksmen. The commander of the Mediterranean Navy even wanted to duel with the officer who made this suggestion. After all, the only people who play with guns these days are nobles and rich people, and ordinary soldiers even use mind bombs for training. The so-called mind bomb is an imaginary exercise holding a gun without bullets. Therefore, most of the soldiers at that time were poor at shooting. Usually only those who have hunted with guns for a long time, or who like shooting, can become sharpshooters. However, there are also some people with extraordinary talents, but due to lack of sufficient practice, they usually cannot reach a very high level. The elite marksmen of the British Army did not die in vain. One of them escaped and came back with shocking news. There is a huge camp in the mountains. There are a large number of sentries on the outside. There are thousands of troops stationed inside, and everyone is an elite shooter. In addition, there are a large number of siege weapons and even cavalry. Elite marksmen or sharpshooters at that time were not productive, so the commander of the garrison at that time thought that this brave soldier was confused and did not pay much attention to it. The garrison also didn't believe this news. After all, if there really was such an army in the mountains, why didn't they just fight over? How were the heavy siege artillery transported into the mountains? What are those cavalry here for? It all seemed so unreasonable. As a result, a legend spread among the British troops in Albania. That is, the old man of the mountains actually lived in the mountains in the north. Those who came to hunt them were Hassan, who was chosen by the old man in the mountain. Legend has it that these people were all highly skilled assassins who were not afraid of death. In fact, these British people accidentally came close to the truth of the matter after thinking about it for a while. But the people living there were not the old men in the mountains, but the Chasseur Academy of the Austrian Empire. Those who came here are indeed elites from all over the Austrian Empire. They are currently here to practice with the British troops stationed in Durrës. Sentinel Jack suddenly heard the sound of a branch being trampled, and his nerves immediately became tense. Who is it? Who's there? Don't shout. It's me, one of our own. A disheveled soldier ran out of the woods, which made Jack breathe a sigh of relief. After all, he answered in English, and was wearing a soldier's uniform. Although the tone is a bit strange, it is normal. After all, no one wants to come to this ghost place. The British government has to find some refugees from Ireland to die. It is normal for their tone to be strange. It's just that this time is not a time when soldiers can go out, and the other party is obviously not an officer. Reasonably, the sentry Jack should conduct an investigation and report to his superiors. The other party seemed to have noticed Jack's intention and quickly made a silence gesture. Jack was a little helpless, and the other party took out a bottle of wine from his arms. Wine is a good thing in the military camp. After all, one drink can relieve 1,000 worries, and Albania is located in a remote area and the ration is not large. Coupled with the endless assassinations and kidnappings, the entire military camp was always in a state of tension. Although restricting soldiers' movement ensured safety to a certain extent, it also made supplies even more scarce. Some officers who had obtained the power to go out even used it to make profits. A glass of low quality rum and water, which cost only 5 pence in London, actually cost 5 shillings here. 1 shilling equals 12 pence. This 5 shillings is equivalent to a week's salary for this soldier. You must know that this is the area with the highest death rate among all British military stations in the world. When Jack saw the other party's sincerity, he naturally didn't want to say anything. He put the gun on his back and was about to pick up the bottle of wine. But the moment the two parties came into contact, the smile disappeared from the face of the soldier who went out privately, and he was dragged into the woods. A moment later, a group of British soldiers walked out swaggeringly, and one of them was still standing in Jack's position, as if nothing had happened. At night, a fire broke out in the military camp and an explosion occurred in the arsenal. Several officers took advantage of the chaos and drove away the flagship, and the remaining ships were bombed and sunk. Everything happened so suddenly that most soldiers didn't know what happened. They only knew that their camp was in ruins overnight. However, there was not much time left for them to think. At dawn, the British Army, which had been struggling all night, encountered another attack by local armed forces. If it were normal times, they could completely keep those Albanians out with high wall fortresses. However, the interior of the fortress had collapsed. Coupled with a night of panic, fear, and fatigue, The British army repelled the looting Albanians with great sacrifice. Night fell again, and this time no one among the 3,316 officers and soldiers of the British garrison was spared. A Montenegrin mercenary imitated the Albanian example and cut off the ear of a dead British soldier, and others followed suit. When the Albanian armed forces discovered the next day that the mountain that had weighed on their hearts for many years had finally been removed, they piled the bodies of the British soldiers together, lit a fire, and immediately started singing and dancing. The Albanian garrison officers who escaped 2 days later came to Crete claiming that Durrës had been attacked by Albanians. Commodore Baron Wesley of Crete immediately realized the seriousness of the problem. He immediately mobilized most of the island's forces and 10 battleships to sail to the Adriatic Gulf. Because Britain officially declared war on Austria today, according to the previous plan, they would wait for the squadron of the Mediterranean fleet to join them. However, the port of Durrës was suddenly attacked at this time. Brigadier General Wesley felt that it was most likely the Austrians who did it in order to break through the blockade. However, after Brigadier General Wesley arrived at the port of Durrës, he only encountered a group of Albanians who were rebuilding the port. The latter were naturally no match for the British regular army, and the outcome of the battle between the two sides was quickly determined. Brigadier Wesley learned from the prisoners that they were helped by the Old Man of the Mountain. However, the name sounded very Arabic, so Brigadier General Wesley was a little confused as to why Durrës was attacked. But he knew very well that the mission of his fleet was to block the Adriatic Sea, so Commodore Wesley sent someone to notify Crete to let the subsequent fleet join him to complete the mission. However, his men soon brought back even more incredible news. That is, the Austrian navy had invaded the island of Crete. He saw a fleet of at least 30 ships heading west. Brigadier General Wesley was confused for a moment. How did the Austrians invade Crete? How did a large fleet of 30 ships slip past under his nose? A lot of questions filled Brigadier General Wesley's mind, and shouldn't the Austrians go their own way after conquering the big island of Crete? After all, relying on the strong to bully the weak is the most basic rule of naval warfare. It is impossible for the Austrians not to know this. At this time, Commodore Wesley's fleet is the most vulnerable to annihilation. At this time, Brigadier General Wesley thought of the most impossible answer. Are the Austrians crazy? Do they want to find a decisive battle with the main force of the Mediterranean fleet, then rush back to Crete at this time? Protect important maritime nodes first. Wrong. This was probably a conspiracy by the Austrians. How could his boats be faster than the battleships? Brigadier General Wesley immediately ordered all the officers and soldiers on the ship that had sent the message to Crete to be arrested and interrogated. He did not believe that everyone had colluded. Brigadier General Wesley felt that he must now send someone to contact the large island of Crete and then prepare for a decisive battle with the Austrians in the bay. To this end, he ordered the soldiers to push the artillery onto the fort, and he wanted to increase his own firepower as much as possible. On April 1, 1848, the British Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet was completely wiped out in the Battle of the Mediterranean. Chapter 874 Self-Inflicted Evil. On March 27, 1848, Britain officially declared war on Austria. Lieutenant Admiral Edward Princeton, commander of the British Mediterranean Navy, felt that London's proposal was stupid. You must know that the French Grand Eastern Fleet is not weak. The Great Eastern Fleet in the port of Toulon, France, has a total of 38 main warships, 13 of which were launched in the past 3 years, all equipped with the most advanced artillery. What's even more terrible is that London does not know that the French also have a large number of auxiliary ships and inferior gunboats, which will become an important factor in determining the outcome of a naval battle. The British Mediterranean Fleet was supplemented at this time with 50 main battleships, and the world's most advanced paddle wheel battleships seemed to have an absolute advantage against the French. But the problem is that the number of auxiliary ships in the British Mediterranean Fleet is seriously insufficient, less than 1/20th of the French. And as long as France wants, they can temporarily recruit more ships in addition, although the paddle wheel warships are advanced. The Mediterranean Navy does not have a coal refueling point and can only go to the port of Piraeus in Greece to refuel a coal point. However, not long ago, the British Foreign Secretary's department did another immoral thing, which was the famous Don Pacifico incident. The whole story of this incident has been distorted many times in history, and the truth has long been changed beyond recognition. Later generations do not care about the truth. Some people regard it as an evil act of gunboat diplomacy and ridicule, and criticize it. Some people think this is a model of Western humanistic spirit. No matter where you go, there is a strong motherland and its army behind you. However, after hundreds of years of continuous fabrication and interpretation, some people placed it on the head of the United States. No matter where you go, the United States government and military would support you forever. This kind of thing is basically no different from a certain wolf killing everyone in Africa. But this was a good opportunity for Franz. King Otto I of Greece was actually one of his cousins. Otto I was different from his father Ludwig I. He was a very responsible king. At least he wanted to be a good king subjectively. However, Otto I's abilities were very limited. He was too idealistic, and his luck was extremely bad. He gave the Greeks a dream of Manna Graecia, but was unable to realize it, and eventually stepped down in a seemingly minor crisis. The British only said that a British Jewish businessman, Don Pacifico, lost his home and goods to anti-Semitic persecution in Greece, but the Greek government turned a blind eye. In order to protect its citizens overseas, the British government decided to send troops to Greece to seek justice for them. In the end, the Greek government had to feel ashamed in front of the powerful British justice and compensated Don Pacifico £1.5 million. This was equivalent to 2 years of fiscal revenue for the Greek government at the time, and the Prime Minister had to resign sadly. But at this time, Otto I said that a Jewish businessman named Don Pacifico was peddling the so-called panacea in Athens, which resulted in the death of a large number of children. So the angry people attacked his mansion. The Greek government refuses to pay any compensation to this harmful person, and would definitely sanction him if it were not for the fact that he is British. Otto I even sent several bottles of samples of the panacea to Franz. After testing, as Franz expected, it turned out to be opium, and it was adulterated. However, this kind of thing is a matter of benevolence and wisdom. Franz will not listen to one side or the other side, but he will also choose what is beneficial to him. After being rejected by the Greek government, Don Pacifico found the British government, but at first no one cared about this little guy. After all, Greece was one of Britain's most important allies in the Mediterranean. So Don Pacifico thought of Lord Palmerston, who helped the Sassoon family. Since the latter could launch a war against the most powerful empire in the Far East, it shouldn't be a problem to get his goods back in Greece. To say that Palmerston is really very talented is because the top British officials, especially the traditional aristocrats, feel that maintaining relations with Greece is far more important than the goods of a Jewish businessman. But it was under such extremely unfavorable circumstances that Palmerston convinced the British Parliament with a speech that would go down in history. There can be no doubt that the government of a great nation like ours is the ultimate ideal for all men of all opinions. Being able to lead the policies of such a country and influence its destiny is a noble and respectable thing. We have witnessed turmoil across Europe. We have seen thrones shaken, shattered, razed to the ground, institutions subverted and destroyed. Europeans flooded the earth with their blood, from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean. This is a sight worthy of appreciation by all mankind. Only we can prove to the world that freedom and order can coexist, and that personal freedom and compliance with the law are not irreconcilable. We are an example to a country where every person, at every level, accepts his or her destiny. At the same time, every individual in our country is constantly striving to improve his or her social status, not through injustice and wrong, not through violence and illegal means, but through insisting on good behavior, so as to develop the gifts given to mankind by the Creator. namely morality and intelligence point. But at this time, an upright, brave and hard-working businessman who represented the British spirit was unfairly treated by an evil authoritarian country, which made me sad. Point out of love for this great constitutional nation, I believe we have an obligation to protect our fellow citizens abroad. I feel it is a duty that every British subject in any country may have confidence that the caring eye and the strong arm of his country will protect him from injustice and wrong. Just as Romans once were immune from insult simply by saying, "I'm a Roman citizen." The British put pressure on the Greek government, but Otto I and his prime minister had a very tough attitude. They were unwilling to pay for things they had not done wrong. In the eyes of the Greeks, this was an insult to them by the British, so it became extremely difficult for the Mediterranean fleet to go to Greece to resupply. The Greeks were always desperately looking for the poorest coal to provide to the British, and tampering with the British's food and drinking water. This made Edward Collinson, commander of the Mediterranean Navy, very angry, but he was really not easy to get angry at this time. After all, he had to get along with the Greeks for a long time. As time goes by, the resentment of the Greeks against the British has not disappeared. The negative impact of the Don Pacifico incident in 1847 is expanding, and a sentiment called nationalism is spreading among the Greeks for safety reasons. Edward Princeton had to purchase supplies from other countries and stockpile them on the large island of Crete. But one thing he overlooked was that the inhabitants of Crete were also Greeks. With the help of the Greek government and Friedrich's intensive thinking, the Austrian side knew the layout of Crete and their every move better than Edward Clinton. Chapter 875. Take a gamble. March 28, 1848, Western Mediterranean. According to London's plan, Edward Princeton dispatched 10 main battleships and 20 auxiliary ships of various types to Durrës to prepare for the blockade of the Adriatic Sea. His plan was to use the main force to suppress the French Grand Eastern Fleet, and then use the squadron in the favorable position of Durrës to blockade the Austrian Navy. Although this would put the British Mediterranean Navy at a relative disadvantage compared to France's Grand Eastern Fleet, it is difficult to ensure that they have sufficient combat effectiveness now that the French regime has changed. Moreover, Edward Princeton had enough confidence in his own fleet, not to mention the Great Eastern Fleet. Even if the French transferred the Great Western Fleet, he could escape, even if he couldn't defeat it. After all, the speed of British naval warships was the fastest in the world at this time. In the windless zone of the Mediterranean, the French could not create miracles, so he was so confident. As for the blockade of the Austrian Navy by 20 battleships, Edward Princeton felt that it was a bit of a fuss. He was not questioning the intelligence of the Austrians, but the Austrian naval commander must be an idiot, because he actually wanted to build an iron-hulled ship. In fact, Edward Princeton still did not believe that iron-hulled ships could float on the sea. Not only did he believe that ironclad ships could float on the sea, but at this time, most of the generals of the British Navy thought that ironclad ships were nonsense. Then combined with some not so good rumors about the Habsburg family, Edward Princeton easily concluded that Frederick was a fool. Especially after the latter married an Arab woman, he could already conclude that Friedrich had some serious illness. And to put it another way, even if the Adriatic Sea battle was lost, the British Navy could still withdraw into the port of Durrës, unless one side has an absolute advantage in the battle. This kind of port attack and defense battle may last for several months. Moreover, the Austrians' target was Pius IX of Rome. Even if they succeeded, it would not be a big deal. The British government could just unite other countries to continue to sanction Austria. The most difficult thing is the small boats that the French use to transport supplies. March 29, 1848, fog. Edward Princeton hated foggy days the most because his view of the sea was almost completely blocked, and he didn't know what would happen after the fog lifted. In the port of Toulon, the French Grand Orient Fleet came out in full force. Fleet Commander Bac-Reynaud refused the appointment of the provisional government, but he would fight for France until the last moment of his life. Bac-Reynaud first threw the Marshal's scepter and medal awarded by the French provisional government into the sea, and then tore off the royal coat of arms symbolizing the Orleans dynasty, and also threw it into the sea. Brothers, the British warships are showing off outside the port of Toulon. This is our French inland sea. As French soldiers, Can we tolerate it? The enemy is running rampant right at the gate of our country. Why should they intercept our ship? Why don't you recognize our country? The thing is, the British never lose. The British think their navy is the best in the world. But they met us today. They're doomed. They think we don't dare to challenge. But we just don't have the Nile estuary, Copenhagen, or Trafalgar. They must pay for the centuries-old blood feud. Today we are neither kings nor conquerors. We are only here for France. Even if we are buried in the sea today, we will die for honor. This battle is related to the honor of our French nation, the life and death of millions of French people overseas, and the dignity of our French nation. We are only allowed to win and not lose. Anyone, including me, who takes a step back can immediately implement military law. When the fog cleared, the situation that Edward Collinston least expected to encounter happened. An entire French fleet appeared in front of them. Damn it. Can't they just stay in the port? That would be good for us all. Edward Princeton roared hysterically, because at this time he only had 30 battleships in hand, and splitting his forces has always been a taboo in naval warfare. However, as an experienced naval officer, he immediately ordered the fleet to spread horizontally, to seize the T-head point. Although the British Mediterranean fleet is not as elite as the North Sea fleet, it is still a fleet with high hopes. In addition, with an excellent command like Edward Princeton, the tactics are implemented very resolutely, and the formation is deployed immediately. But they soon discovered that this was completely unnecessary, because the French had no intention of playing tea-grabbing tactics with them, but dozens of ships rushed straight towards the British fleet. The tea-fighting tactic has its advantages if it can last for hundreds of years. The British army that grabbed the T-head severely damaged France as soon as they came up, and 2 3,000-ton battleships were directly severely damaged. Buckway Reynolds' flagship even had one mast broken. Edward Collinston discovered the opponent's flagship in the telescope. He immediately ordered a semaphore and concentrated all firepower to sink the enemy's flagship. You asked for it, Edward Collinston said coldly. Buckway Reynolds watched the first mate who had been following him for many years fall in a pool of blood. Just now, this old friend used his chest to block the flying deck for himself. However, he didn't even have time to grieve for a moment before he pushed away the dead helmsman and shouted, "Everyone, right rudder, prepare to engage the enemy." The French flagship's sudden change of direction evaded most of the British fleet's firepower, but still suffered heavy losses. But that doesn't matter anymore, because Buckway Reynolds' flagship has been inserted directly into the center of the British Mediterranean fleet, next to a British third-class battleship. The two sides immediately started a bloody and cruel artillery battle at zero distance. The gunners on both sides could see the sweat and tears on the other side's face. Fire, fire, fire. The commanders on both sides shouted heartbreakingly, but their voices disappeared in the next second. The huge solid projectile shot through the side of the ship, splattering sawdust and flesh everywhere. The destructive power of artillery at almost zero range is unimaginable, and some soldiers were directly beaten into a mist of blood. But it was just the beginning. While the British army was still looking for living gunners in the ruins and preparing for the second round of shooting, countless anchor hooks were thrown at the British ship. The French were going to fight desperately. This is just a microcosm of the battlefield. The French soldiers are not lacking in blood. In fact, they have been suppressed by Guizot and Louis Philippe for too long. In addition to making France's diplomatic situation unprecedentedly bad, the new French provisional government was also very afraid of the British and strictly ordered the Great Eastern Fleet not to go to war like all the Navy soldiers. Buckway Reynolds could only get drunk day and night in the port of Toulon, and at the same time he had to endure people's criticism. Even some prostitutes laughed at them as weaklings without seed. But one day the Count of Chambord found them, and at first Buckway Reynolds thought he was just another usurper trying to win over him. But Count Chambord said that he could help France get rid of the British fleet, just to see if they had the courage to take a gamble. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.